Hey there, wonderful viewers. If you're enjoying my content, please take a second to hit that like button. It really helps the YouTube algorithm show my videos to more people. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Now grab your favorite drink, sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's story. I promise it'll be worth your time. The summer of 2019 was particularly scorching in northern Michigan, but that didn't deter our plans. Me and my three closest friends, Henry, Jasper, and Noah, had been planning this trip for months. Noah's father owned a remote hunting cabin about 30 miles from the nearest town, nestled deep in the densely wooded wilderness where cell reception was spotty at best and non-existent at worst. I was 32 that year, the oldest of our group by only a few months. We'd all been friends since college, bonded by our shared love of the outdoors and an unspoken need to occasionally escape our increasingly demanding professional lives. This week-long retreat was meant to be restorative. Fishing, hiking, drinking beers around a fire, and reconnecting with both nature and each other. The drive up was filled with the usual banter and anticipation. We arrived at the dirt access road around noon, and from there it was another 45 minutes of bumpy driving before we reached the cabin itself. "Home sweet home," Noah announced as we pulled into the small clearing. The cabin was rustic but solid, a two-bedroom structure built from weathered logs with a stone chimney rising from its center. A wide porch wrapped around the front, complete with a pair of rocking chairs that had seen better days. The surrounding forest was thick with towering pines and ancient oaks, their canopies creating a perpetual twilight even in the height of day. The air smelled of pine sap and rich soil, undisturbed by the pollution of the city. In the distance I could hear the gentle babbling of the creek Noah had promised would be full of trout. "Your dad really knows how to pick 'em," I said, inhaling deeply as I stepped out of the car. "Can't even hear a highway from here." "That's the point," Noah replied, unloading supplies from the trunk. "Dad always said the further you get from other people, the closer you get to yourself." Henry chuckled, lighting a cigarette. "Or the closer you get to being eaten by bears." "The only predators around here are coyotes and the occasional mountain lion," Noah said with authority. "Nothing we can't handle." Jasper, always the most observant among us, was already surveying the tree line with interest. "There's a hunting platform in that oak," he noted, pointing to a sturdy-looking wooden structure about 15 feet up. "Is that your dad's?" Noah nodded. "Built it himself about 10 years ago. Great spot for deer hunting in the fall. You can see the whole eastern approach to the clearing from up there." We spent the next hour unloading our gear and settling into the cabin. Inside it was simple but comfortable. A main room with a stone fireplace and kitchenette. 2 bedrooms with bunk beds and a small bathroom with running water, courtesy of a well and generator setup. As the afternoon progressed, I found myself drawn to the windows, studying the dense wall of trees that surrounded us. Despite the warm welcome of sunshine and birdsong, I couldn't shake a peculiar sensation, as if the forest was studying us just as intently in return. "Who's up for some fishing?" Jasper asked around 3 o'clock, already assembling his rod. The temperature had climbed to nearly 90 degrees, and the prospect of cool creek water was appealing to all of us. The path to the creek wound through the forest for about a quarter mile, barely visible beneath the undergrowth. Noah led the way confidently, having visited many times before with his father. "Watch your step," he warned as we descended a steep embankment. "Some of these rocks get slick, even in dry weather." The creek revealed itself suddenly, a 20-foot wide ribbon of clear water cutting through the forest floor, bordered by smooth stones and small sandy beaches. Fallen logs created natural bridges at various points, and the water gurgled pleasantly as it navigated around them. "This is perfect," I said, already envisioning the trout that must be hiding in the deeper pools. We spread out along a 50-yard stretch, each claiming our own fishing spot. I found a promising location near a deeper pool, where the water swirled lazily around a half-submerged log. The afternoon passed pleasantly, the 4 of us occasionally calling out when someone got a bite. I'd caught 2 modest-sized trout and was working on my third when Henry's voice cut through the forest sounds. "Guys, check this out." We converged on his position downstream. Henry was pointing at something in the water near the opposite bank. As we focused, I could make out the distinctive pattern of a water snake, its body undulating gracefully against the current. That's a northern water snake, Noah identified. Non-venomous, but they'll still bite if you mess with them. The snake was nearly 3 feet long, its dark body marked with brown and reddish bands. It moved with surprising speed against the current, hunting for small fish or frogs. "Hold up," Jasper said, pulling out his phone to take a picture. "This'll make a great shot." What happened next occurred so quickly that we barely had time to process it. As Jasper raised his phone, a shadow passed overhead. There was a rush of air, a splash, and suddenly a red-tailed hawk was rising from the creek, the snake writhing in its powerful talons. "Holy!" Henry's exclamation was cut short as we watched the hawk ascend, the snake fighting desperately in its grasp. The violence of nature played out above us as the hawk adjusted its grip mid-flight, the snake's struggles growing weaker. Then both predator and prey disappeared over the tree line, leaving us in stunned silence. "Did you get that?" I asked Jasper. He nodded, reviewing the sequence on his phone. "Got the whole thing." "That was intense." "Nature's brutal," Noah said quietly. "Dad always says we forget that when we're living in cities." The encounter left us subdued as we packed up our fishing gear. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, lengthening the shadows around us. It was time to head back and prepare dinner. As we gathered our things, I noticed something odd about the forest. The ambient sounds, the birds, insects, and rustling leaves had diminished significantly. The woods had grown unnaturally quiet, as if holding its collective breath. "We should get back," I said, suddenly eager to return to the cabin's relative safety. "It'll be dark soon." The path back seemed different somehow, darker, more enclosed. I attributed it to the changing angle of the sun, but couldn't shake a growing unease. About halfway to the cabin, Noah stopped abruptly, causing me to nearly collide with him. "Look," he whispered, pointing to our right. Through the trees, perhaps 30 yards away, stood a deer. In Michigan, white-tailed deer are common enough, but my immediate impression was that something was off about this one. Even at a distance, it appeared unusually large. "That's a buck," Henry whispered. "Big one, too." As our eyes adjusted, I could make out more details. The deer was partially obscured by a large oak, but its head and neck were visible. What struck me was its posture. It wasn't grazing or moving, but standing perfectly still, its head turned directly toward us. "Is it just me, or is that thing watching us?" Jasper murmured. He was right. Unlike typical deer that bolt at the first sign of human presence, this one was deliberately observing us. Its head rose above the underbrush at a height that seemed impossible for a normal deer. "Noah," I said quietly, "how tall would you say that thing is?" Noah squinted. "It's hard to tell from here, but that oak it's standing behind is one I know well. If its head is where I think it is, that deer has to be at least 7 feet at the shoulder." "That's impossible," Henry scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. The deer continued to stare, unmoving. Then Henry, in a moment of either bravery or foolishness, stepped forward and made a soft clicking sound with his tongue, the kind you might use to call a dog. "Henry, what the hell?" I hissed. "It's not a freaking dog." "I just want to see what it does," he replied, making the sound again. The deer's response was subtle but unmistakable. Its head tilted slightly, an almost human gesture of curiosity. Then very deliberately it stepped backward, disappearing behind the tree. We waited for it to emerge on the other side, but it never did. "Let's keep moving," Noah said, his earlier confidence noticeably diminished. No one argued. We continued toward the cabin at a quicker pace, each lost in thought. I found myself repeatedly glancing over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that we were being followed. The familiar outline of the cabin was a welcome sight as we emerged from the tree line. The building seemed somehow smaller and more vulnerable than it had earlier, dwarfed by the surrounding forest that now took on a more oppressive quality in the fading light. "I'll get the fire going," Noah announced, heading for the stone fire pit in front of the cabin. "We should cook those fish before they spoil." While Noah busied himself with the fire, Henry lit another cigarette and settled into one of the porch chairs. Jasper and I decided to pass the time with a little competition. "Bet I can stick this tomahawk in that dead pine over there," Jasper challenged, retrieving a small throwing axe from his bag. "You're on," I replied, grateful for the distraction. Loser cooks dinner. The dead pine stood about 15 feet away, its bark gray and peeling. Jasper took the first throw, the tomahawk rotating once before striking the tree with a satisfying thunk, burying itself an inch deep. "Your turn," he grinned, retrieving the axe. Our competition continued as the sky darkened and Noah's fire grew stronger. The physical activity helped ease the tension that had built during our encounter in the forest, though I noticed we all frequently glanced toward the tree line. By the time the fire was properly blazing, Jasper had won our contest by 2 throws. "Hope you're ready to cook," he teased as I conceded defeat. The evening progressed pleasantly enough. We grilled the trout along with some hot dogs, cracked open beers, and tried to recapture our earlier enthusiasm for the trip. As darkness fully enveloped the forest, the fire became our center of gravity, its warm light creating a small circle of safety against the pressing blackness beyond. "So about that deer," Henry said after his first beer, voicing what we'd all been thinking about. "That was weird, right?" "Definitely not normal behavior," Noah agreed. "Deer don't typically stand their ground like that, especially not with 4 humans present." "Forget the behavior," Jasper interjected. "Did you see the size of it?" "I've been hunting since I was 12, and I've never seen a whitetail that big." Noah nodded solemnly. When it was standing behind that oak, its head was almost level with that broken branch. That would put it at the size of a large horse, maybe bigger. "Could it have been an elk?" I suggested, searching for a rational explanation. "They get pretty big." "No elk in this part of Michigan," Noah replied. "Not for decades." We fell silent, each contemplating the anomaly we'd witnessed. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the night sky. From somewhere deep in the forest came the haunting call of an owl. "My dad used to tell stories," Noah said finally, his voice low. "Old hunters' tales about strange things in these woods. I always thought they were just stories meant to keep me from wandering too far." "What kind of stories?" Henry asked, leaning forward. Noah shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable. "Just old folklore. Every forest has them. Native American legends, settler superstitions, that sort of thing." "About deer?" Jasper pressed. "About things that use familiar shapes to hide their true nature," Noah replied cryptically. "Look, it was probably just an unusually large buck, maybe with some genetic mutation. Nothing supernatural." The conversation drifted to other topics after that, but an undercurrent of unease remained. None of us ventured far from the fire, and we all agreed to turn in relatively early. By midnight, we had doused the fire and retreated to the safety of the cabin, securing the door behind us. Sleep came surprisingly easy, despite the day's unsettling encounter. The physical exertion of fishing and the calming effect of a few beers likely contributed to my quick descent into unconsciousness. I was assigned one of the bottom bunks in the main bedroom, with Jasper above me and Noah and Henry in the second bedroom. I don't know how long I slept before the sound penetrated my dreams. At first, it incorporated itself into my subconscious, a distant calling that my dreaming mind attributed to someone shouting my name. But as consciousness gradually returned, the sound resolved into something else entirely. It was a buck call, the distinctive grunting sound male deer make during rutting season. Even in my groggy state, 2 things immediately struck me as wrong. It was June, not rutting season, and the sound was somehow distorted, deeper and more resonant than any deer call I'd ever heard. I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. The cabin was silent except for Jasper's steady breathing above me. The call came again, closer this time. It seemed to originate from just beyond the cabin walls, a low, guttural sound that bore only a passing resemblance to a normal deer vocalization. Carefully, I slipped from my bunk and moved to the window. The night was clear, moonlight bathing the clearing in a ghostly blue glow. I scanned the tree line, expecting to see nothing. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure. In the moonlight, its silhouette was unmistakable, the general shape of a deer, but wrong in fundamental ways. It stood upright on 2 legs, its proportions disturbingly human-like despite the distinctly servant head. Even from a distance, I could see that its antlers were massive, extending outward and upward like gnarled branches. Fear cemented me in place as the creature took a deliberate step forward, then another, emerging fully from the tree line. Its movement was fluid yet unnatural, a bipedal gait that no deer should possess. As it approached the cabin, I shrank back from the window, heart hammering against my ribs. The creature stopped about 20 yards from the cabin, raised its head, and emitted that terrible approximation of a buck call again. Then it turned its head directly toward my window. I dropped to the floor, pressing my back against the wall beneath the window. Seconds stretched into an eternity as I fought to control my breathing, certain that any sound would betray my presence. The floorboards outside my window creaked. Something large was moving along the side of the cabin, its weight causing the old wood to protest. I remained frozen, listening to its progress until the sound stopped directly outside my window. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I slowly raised myself just enough to peer over the windowsill. The face that greeted me would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was at first glance the head of a white-tailed buck, but observed closely the wrongness of it became apparent. The eyes were too forward-facing, too intelligent. The mouth, partially open as it exhaled cloudy breath against the glass, contained teeth that no herbivore should possess, sharp, almost canine in appearance. The creature's head nearly reached the top of the window, which I knew to be over 7 feet from the ground. Its antlers extended beyond, scraping softly against the cabin's wooden exterior. We stared at each other through the glass, separated by mere inches. Its eyes reflected the moonlight with an unnatural amber glow. There was intelligence in that gaze, a calculating awareness that sent waves of primal terror through my body. Then, ever so slowly, it raised one limb. Not a hoof, but something closer to a hand, with elongated fingers ending in dark curved claws. It pressed this appendage against the glass as if testing its strength. I remained paralyzed, certain that any movement would provoke an attack. The creature continued its examination of the window, running its clawed hand along the frame, searching for weakness. Finding none, it lowered its appendage and took a step back. For a moment I thought it was leaving. Instead, it tilted its head in that unsettlingly human manner, turned, and moved away from my window, heading toward the other side of the cabin, toward Henry and Noah's room. I don't know how long I remained frozen beneath the window. My mind raced with conflicting impulses. Hide, warn my friends, find a weapon. Before I could decide on a course of action, a blood-curdling scream tore through the cabin. "Get away from me." Henry's voice, pitched high with terror, galvanized me into action. I lurched to my feet as Jasper jolted awake above me. "What's happening?" he demanded, already scrambling down from his bunk. "Something's attacking Henry," I gasped, rushing toward the door. "The deer. It's not a deer." We burst into the hallway just as Noah emerged from the second bedroom, shotgun in hand. "It was at the window," he said, his face pale in the dim light. Reaching inside. Another scream from Henry propelled us into the bedroom. He was pressed against the far wall, his right arm clutched to his chest, blood seeping between his fingers. "It had my arm," he choked out. Tried to pull me through the window. The window beside his bunk was open several inches. Henry had always preferred fresh air while sleeping. Outside we could hear heavy movement, branches snapping under substantial weight. "We need to close and lock every entrance," Noah commanded, taking charge. "Windows, doors, everything, now!" We moved with desperate efficiency, securing each potential entry point. As I rushed to lock the front door, a heavy impact shook the entire structure. Something large had slammed against the wall. "It's testing the cabin," Noah said grimly, checking the shotgun's chamber, looking for a way in. The distorted buck call sounded again, now directly outside the main room. It was followed by another impact, this one against the door. The wood creaked but held. "What the hell is that thing?" Jasper whispered. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. "I don't know," Noah admitted, positioning himself in the center of the room with the shotgun raised. "But it's not leaving." The attacks continued, methodical and determined. The creature circled the cabin, testing each wall, window, and door. Occasionally we caught glimpses of it through the windows, always that impossible silhouette. Part deer, part man, wholly terrifying. Henry sat at the kitchen table, his wounded arm now bandaged with a torn t-shirt. The cuts were deep but had mostly stopped bleeding. "It had claws," he said dully, staring at nothing. "And fingers. Like hands, but not hands." None of us knew how to respond to that. The siege continued for what felt like hours. The creature seemed tireless in its determination to find a way inside. We took turns watching the windows while Noah kept the shotgun trained on the most vulnerable points. "If it gets in," he said quietly during a momentary lull in the attacks, "aim for the chest. Even if it's not natural, it should still have vital organs." The implication hung heavy in the air. None of us had come on this trip expecting to fight for our lives. Around 3 a.m., the attack suddenly ceased. The forest fell silent, not even the normal nocturnal sounds penetrating the quiet. We remained vigilant, certain it was a trick, a lull designed to lower our guard. "Do you think it's gone?" Jasper finally asked after 30 minutes of silence. "I'm not counting on it," Noah replied, his knuckles white around the shotgun. "But maybe it's regrouping or hunting. Either way, we stay locked down until daylight." Dawn couldn't come fast enough. First light arrived with agonizing slowness. None of us had slept, our nerves frayed by the night's ordeal. As sunlight gradually filtered through the windows, we remained huddled in the main room, waiting for full daybreak before considering our next move. "I need to see outside," Noah finally said as the sun cleared the eastern tree line. "We need to know what we're dealing with." With the shotgun at the ready, he cautiously approached the front window. The rest of us hung back, prepared to barricade ourselves in the bedrooms if necessary. "I don't see anything moving," Noah reported after scanning the clearing. "But there's evidence." "Then what kind of evidence?" I asked, dreading the answer. Noah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he moved to each window methodically, surveying the area around the cabin. His expression grew increasingly troubled. "It's safe to go out," he announced finally. "At least I think it is. But you need to see this for yourselves." We carefully unbarricaded the front door. Noah exited first, shotgun raised, while the rest of us followed cautiously. The morning air was crisp and clean, belying the horror of the previous night. The damage to the cabin was immediately apparent. Deep gouges marked the walls where the creature had attacked, splintered wood hanging in strips. The front door showed significant damage, the frame partially separated from the wall, but it was the ground around the cabin that truly confirmed our encounter. Footprints circled the entire structure, not the typical cloven hoofprints of a deer, but something far more disturbing. They were larger than a man's foot, with a hybrid quality that defied easy description. The front portion resembled a hoof, but the rear splayed out into something almost hand-like, with distinct digit impressions. "These aren't deer tracks," Jasper stated the obvious, kneeling to examine one particularly clear impression. "Not bear or mountain lion either." "Look at the size," I added, placing my open hand next to one print. My entire hand fit easily within its perimeter. Noah had moved to examine the exterior wall beneath Henry's window. "There's blood here," he noted grimly, "and hair caught in the wood." We gathered around. Snagged in the splintered siding were several coarse hairs, too long and thick for a deer, more similar to human hair but with an unusual reddish-brown coloration. "There's something else," Noah said, his voice strained. He pointed upward. On the cabin's roof lay the carcass of a deer, a young doe, its body broken and mangled. But it wasn't the dead animal itself that caused us to recoil in horror. It was the manner of its demise. The doe's chest cavity had been torn open, ribs splayed outward, its heart and liver conspicuously absent. "It was feeding," Henry whispered, clutching his bandaged arm tighter, like it was leaving us a message. No one disputed his interpretation. Our examination continued with growing dread. The creature had circled the cabin dozens of times during the night, its tracks indicating a methodical search for entry points. In some places, the ground was torn up where it had apparently stood in place, possibly listening or planning its next move. "We need to leave," I said finally, voicing what we were all thinking. Now today, no one argued. We returned to the cabin and began packing with urgent efficiency, each of us processing the impossible evidence we'd witnessed. The previous night, fear and darkness had allowed for potential misinterpretation. But in the clear light of day, the reality was undeniable. We had encountered something that should not exist. We were packed and ready to depart within 30 minutes. Noah insisted on taking photos of the evidence, the tracks, claw marks, and even, reluctantly, the mutilated doe on the roof. "For my father," he explained. "He needs to know what's happening here." The drive out of the forest was tense, each of us starting at shadows among the trees. I took the wheel, Noah riding shotgun with his actual shotgun across his lap. Henry and Jasper sat in the back, scanning the forest on either side of the narrow access road. "What do you think it was?" Jasper finally asked, breaking the heavy silence. No one answered immediately. The question demanded acknowledgement of something beyond our understanding of the natural world. "My grandfather used to tell stories," Noah said eventually, his eyes never leaving the tree line. "He was half Ojibwe, said these forests have always had guardians, spirits that protect the land from those who would harm it." "We weren't harming anything," Henry protested, his voice hoarse. "Some of the stories weren't about protection," Noah continued. "Some were warnings about things that had changed, corrupted, things that started as one creature but became something else. The implication hung in the air as we continued our slow progress toward the main road. When we finally reached the highway, the relief was palpable, as if we'd crossed an invisible boundary beyond which normal rules of reality were restored. We stopped at a diner in the nearest town, each ordering coffee more for the comfort of normality than actual thirst. We agreed on a story for Henry's arm, a fishing accident, a hook gone astray, before seeking medical attention at the local clinic. The doctor who treated Henry's wound frowned at the jagged tears. "This doesn't look like any fishing injury I've seen," she remarked, but didn't press the issue when we maintained our story. The long drive home was subdued. We tried discussing what had happened, attempting to rationalize our experience, but the conversation inevitably circled back to the undeniable evidence of our senses. "Maybe it was some kind of mutation," Jasper suggested. "Radiation or chemical contamination could cause deformities." "Deformities don't explain intelligence," I countered. "That thing was hunting us deliberately. It was thinking." In the weeks that followed, we struggled to readjust to normal life. I found myself startling at unexpected movements glimpsed from the corner of my eye. Shadows took on threatening dimensions. Sleep became elusive, my dreams plagued by antlered silhouettes and amber eyes. Noah contacted his father about the incident. The older man visited the cabin himself, returning with troubling reports of more tracks, more signs of the creature's presence. He closed up the property indefinitely. Henry was the most affected. The physical wounds healed, leaving 3 parallel scars along his forearm, but the psychological damage ran deeper. He developed a pathological fear of forests and would cross the street to avoid even ornamental deer statues. The medication his therapist prescribed helped with the anxiety, but couldn't erase the memory. Jasper and Noah returned to the area once, a year later, during daylight hours and heavily armed. They didn't stay overnight but reported finding more evidence. Deer carcasses with surgical precision to the wounds, unusual tracks and a crude structure of branches high in the trees that resembled no known animal nest. As for me, I've never returned. I can't. The rational part of my mind has constructed various explanations over the years. A deformed predator, perhaps a bear with genetic abnormalities, or even a human psychopath using animal disguise to terrorize intruders. But in my heart, I know the truth. There are things in this world that exist in the boundaries between classification, things that defy our comfortable categorizations, things that watch and wait in the ancient forests, wearing familiar shapes that disguise their true nature. I still fish and occasionally camp, but only in open spaces where visibility extends in all directions. I never venture into dense forests anymore, especially not as daylight wanes. And I never under any circumstances approach deer that stand their ground when humans appear. Some nights, when the wind blows from the north carrying the scent of pine and earth, I find myself checking the locks on my doors and windows. I draw the curtains tight and turn up the television to drown out any sounds from outside. Because deep down I know that what we encountered wasn't confined to those woods. It's still out there, watching, waiting, and I can't escape the terrible certainty that somehow I'll look up to find those amber eyes staring at me through a window once again. I was 8 years old when it happened, back in the summer of 2010. The memory remains etched in my mind with a clarity that defies the passage of time. My name is Daniel, and what I experienced during our family trip to Shady Pines Campground transformed my understanding of fear. The excitement began when my father, James, announced we would be staying in one of the lakeside cabins rather than camping in tents as we usually did. My mother, Diane, had been hesitant about camping since her back surgery the previous winter. So this seemed like the perfect compromise. "It'll be just like camping," Dad said, ruffling my hair, "but with actual beds and a roof over our heads." Mom smiled at that. "And indoor plumbing," she added. "Don't forget that part." I remember watching them pack with barely contained enthusiasm. For years, Dad and I had camped on a small island in the middle of Shady Pines Lake. We'd fish during the day and tell stories around the campfire at night. Those memories were golden, untainted by the shadow that would later fall over our family outings. The drive to Shady Pines took nearly 3 hours. I sat in the back seat with my backpack full of comics, action figures, and a new flashlight Dad had bought me specifically for this trip. The winding roads grew narrower as we approached the campground, tall pines creating tunnels of green that occasionally broke to reveal glimpses of the glittering lake beyond. "We're almost there," Dad said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Excited, buddy?" I nodded vigorously, pressing my face against the window. The car slowed as we turned onto the gravel road leading to the campground entrance. A wooden sign, weathered by years of rain and sun, welcomed us to Shady Pines. Even now I can picture that sign perfectly, the paint peeling at the edges, a small carving of a pine tree in the corner. The camp manager, Mr. Henderson, greeted us at the office. He was an older man with leathery skin and hands calloused from years of outdoor work. His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, but there was something in his gaze that seemed to look through rather than at you. "Cabin 7, he said, handing my father a key attached to a wooden tag. "It's one of our newer ones right by the lake. Beautiful spot." As Mr. Henderson processed our paperwork, I wandered around the small office. Taxidermied fish hung on the walls alongside faded photographs of smiling families and record-breaking catches. A glass case near the counter displayed various campground souvenirs, keychains, postcards, and t-shirts with the Shady Pines logo. "First time staying in one of our cabins?" Mr. Henderson asked, his attention suddenly fixed on me. I nodded, suddenly shy under his scrutiny. "You'll like it," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "Though some kids say they hear strange things at night. The wind through the pines can sound like someone whispering, you know?" My mother shot him a disapproving look and he quickly changed his tone. "But it's beautiful. You're going to have a wonderful time." He handed me a small carved wooden figure of a bear, a welcome gift for our younger guests. As we left the office, I examined the wooden bear. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, the wood dark and smooth. Its eyes were tiny dots of black that seemed to follow my movements. "What do you say, Daniel?" Mom prompted. "Thank you," I called back to Mr. Henderson, who waved from the doorway. "Sleep tight," he replied, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. I didn't know it then, but those words would take on a terrible irony in the nights to come. Cabin 7 stood at the end of a short trail, partially hidden by a cluster of tall pines. It was smaller than I had imagined, a single-room structure with a narrow porch and windows that reflected the afternoon sun like vacant eyes. The exterior was log cabin style, though the logs were actually manufactured siding designed to give the appearance of rustic charm. "Home sweet home," Dad announced, unlocking the door and pushing it open. The interior was simple. A small kitchenette with a mini fridge and microwave, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a small sofa, and 2 beds, a queen-sized one against the far wall and a wooden bunk bed tucked into the corner. A door beside the kitchenette led to a tiny bathroom with a shower stall. I immediately ran to the bunk bed. "I call the top bunk," I shouted, already climbing the ladder built into the frame. The wooden rungs felt rough under my hands and the entire structure creaked slightly under my weight. "Are you sure?" Mom asked, setting her bag on the queen bed. "You might roll off in your sleep." "I won't," I promised, already imagining how it would feel to sleep up high like being in a tree fort. Dad laughed. "Let him have his adventure, Diane. I'll take the bottom bunk." I sprawled across the top bunk, testing the mattress. It was thin but comfortable enough, covered with a faded blue bedspread that smelled faintly of detergent and pine. A small window next to the bed looked out into the woods behind the cabin, the view mostly obscured by pine branches. While my parents unpacked, I explored every inch of our temporary home. The cabin's wood paneling gave it a cozy feel, though there were water stains on the ceiling and a few spots where the flooring had warped. A rack of antlers hung above the door, real ones, not decorative replicas, and a painting of the lake at sunset adorned the wall opposite the bunks. What I remember most clearly was the silence. Coming from our house in the suburbs, I wasn't used to the absence of background noise. No distant traffic, no hum of appliances, no neighbors' voices. Here, when conversation stopped, the silence pressed in like something physical. "Can we go to the lake?" I asked, breaking one such silence. "Let's get settled first," Mom said, organizing items in the small closet. "Then we'll have the whole afternoon for exploring." After unpacking, we walked down to the lake. The water stretched out before us, vast and still, reflecting the blue sky and surrounding pines like a perfect mirror. A small dock extended about 20 feet into the water, and several canoes were tied up alongside it. "Remember when we caught that huge bass last year?" Dad asked, pointing toward the island in the center of the lake. "Right off the northern shore of the island." I nodded enthusiastically. "Can we go fishing tomorrow?" "Absolutely," he promised. "First thing in the morning." We spent the remainder of the afternoon exploring the campground. I rode my bike along the gravel roads while my parents walked behind, holding hands and talking quietly. The other cabins were similar to ours, though most were occupied by couples without children. I remember seeing only one other kid, a girl slightly older than me who was reading on the porch of cabin 3. She waved as I rode past, but her parents called her inside before we could talk. As the sun began to set, we returned to our cabin for dinner. Mom had packed sandwiches for our first night, and we ate at the small wooden table, planning our activities for the week ahead. "Fishing tomorrow," Dad said, marking it on the campground map with a pen. "Then maybe hiking the North Trail in the afternoon?" "And swimming," I added. "Don't forget swimming." The evening passed pleasantly enough. Dad taught me how to play gin rummy, and Mom read her novel on the sofa. The cabin grew darker as night fell, the single overhead light casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, crickets began their nightly chorus, and occasionally we heard the distant hoot of an owl. By 9 o'clock, my eyelids were growing heavy. The excitement of the day, combined with the fresh air, had tired me out completely. "Bedtime for you, I think," Mom said. Noticing my yawns, I changed into my pajamas and brushed my teeth in the tiny bathroom. The mirror above the sink was spotted with age, and the fluorescent light buzzed intermittently, flickering just often enough to be unsettling. When I emerged, Dad was already in the bottom bunk, reading a fishing magazine. "All set for your first night in the top bunk?" he asked. I nodded, climbing the wooden ladder. The rungs creaked under my weight, a sound that would later take on horrifying significance. Mom kissed me goodnight, tucking the thin blanket around me. "Sleep well, sweetheart. If you need anything, we're right here." I settled into the unfamiliar bed, my new flashlight and a comic book beside my pillow. The mattress crackled slightly, protected by a plastic cover beneath the sheet, and the bunk frame squeaked whenever I moved. Through the small window, I could see only darkness and the vague silhouettes of pine branches swaying in the night breeze. For about 20 minutes, I read my comic by flashlight, the small beam creating a perfect circle of light on the colorful pages. Gradually, my eyes grew heavier, and I clicked off the light, settling into the darkness that would soon become my enemy. I'm not sure how long I slept before waking. It might have been minutes or hours. In the disorienting darkness of the cabin, time seemed to lose all meaning. What I do know is that when I opened my eyes, the darkness was absolute. My first thought was confusion. At home, my bedroom was never completely dark. The glow of the hallway nightlight always seeped under my door, and the street lamp outside my window cast patterns across my ceiling. Here, the darkness was total, pressing against my eyes like a physical presence. I blinked repeatedly, trying to force my vision to adjust. Slowly, shapes began to emerge from the blackness. The outline of the window, the darker rectangle of the bathroom door, the faintest hint of my father's sleeping form in the bunk below. I could hear his deep rhythmic breathing, occasionally punctuated by a soft snore. From across the room came my mother's lighter breathing. I'm not sure what woke me initially. Perhaps a noise from outside or simply the unfamiliarity of the bed. Whatever the cause, sleep now seemed impossibly distant. I shifted positions, trying to find comfort on the thin mattress, but the plastic cover crinkled loudly with every movement. The night sounds of the forest pressed against the cabin walls. Wind rustled through pine needles, creating a constant whispering backdrop. Occasionally, branches would scrape against the roof or walls with a sound like fingernails. Somewhere in the distance, an animal called out, a high, keening sound that raised the hair on my arms. I reached for my flashlight, but hesitated before turning it on. Something about the darkness felt watchful, as if turning on the light would announce my wakefulness to whatever lurked in the shadows. Instead, I pulled the blanket tighter around me and tried to control my breathing, counting slowly as I inhaled and exhaled. Minutes stretched endlessly. I tried every trick I knew to fall back asleep, counting sheep, repeating the alphabet backward, imagining myself floating on a cloud. Nothing worked. Each time I approached the edge of sleep, something would jolt me back to full alertness. A creak from the cabin, a sudden silence in the forest's night chorus, the feeling of being watched. The woods outside had fallen unnaturally quiet. The constant whisper of wind through pines had ceased, and even the distant calls of night creatures had gone silent. The silence was worse than the sounds had been, a waiting, expectant quiet that seemed to hold its breath. I lay perfectly still, my own breathing shallow and quick. Every instinct warned me not to move, not to make a sound. Something had changed in the atmosphere of the cabin. The darkness felt heavier, more concentrated, particularly in the corner farthest from my bunk. Time became meaningless as I stared into that corner, trying to convince myself that the deeper darkness there was just a trick of my imagination. But the longer I looked, the more certain I became that something was gathering in that space, something that absorbed rather than reflected the faint ambient light. Just as I was about to wake my father, I heard it. Laughter. Not human laughter. Nothing that could have come from a person's throat. It began as a low gurgling chuckle, like water flowing over stones, then transformed into something higher pitched and fractured. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the dark corner, from outside the window, from directly beneath my bunk. I froze, unable even to scream. The sound cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so complete I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Then came the second sound, the one that haunts my nightmares to this day. A soft, deliberate creak of wood. Then another, and another. Something was climbing the ladder to my bunk. Each creak corresponded perfectly to the rungs of the wooden ladder built into the frame. Creak, one rung, pause, creak, second rung. Pause. The methodical pace made it worse somehow, suggesting a terrible patience, an absolute certainty. I could see the ladder from where I lay, but there was nothing visible on it. The rungs bent slightly under weight that I couldn't see, the wood protesting with each new step. Whatever was climbing toward me was invisible in the darkness, or perhaps made of darkness itself. When the fifth rung creaked, I finally found my voice. "Dad!" I screamed, the word tearing from my throat. "Mom, help!" The climbing stopped instantly. My parents startled awake, my father sitting up so quickly he banged his head on the bottom of my bunk. "What? What is it?" he called, his voice thick with sleep. "There's something climbing up to me." I sobbed, curling into the farthest corner of my bunk, as far from the ladder as possible. The overhead light came on as my mother found the switch. The sudden brightness made me squint, but I immediately looked toward the ladder. Nothing was there. The rungs were empty, the wooden frame still. "Daniel, what's wrong?" Mom asked, hurrying to the bunk bed. "Did you have a bad dream?" "No," I insisted, tears streaming down my face. I heard it laughing, and then it was climbing up the ladder to get me. Dad was examining the ladder now, running his hand along the wooden frame. "There's nothing here, buddy. You must have been dreaming." I wasn't asleep. I was awake for a long time before it happened. My parents exchanged that look, the one adults give each other when they think a child is being irrational. It only made me more frantic. "I heard it," I insisted. "First it laughed, and then it started climbing." "What laughed?" Mom asked gently, sitting on the edge of my father's bunk. "What did it sound like?" I struggled to find words. "Not like a person, like something pretending to be happy but really isn't." "And wet?" somehow. Even to my own ears, the description sounded inadequate, failing to capture the bone-deep wrongness of that sound. "There's nothing in the cabin with us," Dad said firmly, checking the locks on the door and windows. "Everything's secure." "I want to come down," I whispered. Dad helped me climb down from the top bunk. I refused to touch the ladder, and Mom made me a cup of hot chocolate from a packet she'd packed. My hands shook so badly that she had to hold the mug for me. "It was just a nightmare," she soothed, stroking my hair. "The first night in a strange place can do that." "Can I sleep with you?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. Mom looked at Dad, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Of course," she said. "Just for tonight." I ended up wedged between my parents and the queen bed, too frightened even to close my eyes. They fell back asleep eventually, but I remained awake until the first gray light of dawn filtered through the curtains, listening to the cabin's every creak and groan, terrified of hearing that laughter again. Morning arrived with merciful brightness, sunlight streaming through the windows and transforming the cabin into a completely ordinary space. The corner that had seemed to harbor concentrated darkness was just that, a corner, containing nothing more threatening than a broom leaning against the wall. I watched my parents move around the cabin, preparing breakfast and discussing plans for the day with casual normalcy. How could they not feel it? The cabin had changed during the night, taking on a malevolent personality that the sunshine couldn't quite erase. Every creak of the floorboards made me flinch. "Sleep okay after all the excitement?" Dad asked, ruffling my hair as he passed. I nodded, not wanting to admit that I hadn't slept at all. Something told me that acknowledging my fear would only make it more real, give it more power. "Great. How about we head out for some fishing after breakfast? The bass are supposed to be biting early this time of year." Part of me wanted to refuse, to insist that we pack our things and leave immediately. But the greater part, the part that still wanted to be the brave son my father expected, nodded again. "Yes, please." Breakfast was simple. Cereal with milk from the mini fridge and sliced bananas. I pushed the food around my bowl, taking mechanical bites when my mother glanced my way. My appetite had vanished, replaced by a constant, low-level nausea that intensified whenever I looked at the bunk bed. "Maybe we should look into that nightmare," Mom said quietly to Dad when she thought I wasn't listening. He seemed really scared. Dad dismissed her concern with a wave. "Kids have nightmares. New place, strange sounds. He'll be fine once he gets used to it." But I wasn't fine. Even in the bright morning light, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The cabin seemed to hold its breath when we weren't speaking, waiting for something. I stayed close to my parents as we prepared for our fishing trip, never allowing myself to be alone in any part of the cabin. Outside, the day was perfect. The sky stretched blue and cloudless above the pines, and the lake sparkled in the sunlight. A light breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh water, along with the distant sounds of other campers starting their day. Everything seemed normal, safe. We walked to the dock where the rental boats were kept. Mr. Henderson was there, checking the engines on several small motorboats. "Morning, folks," he called cheerfully. "Perfect day for fishing." "That's what we're hoping," Dad replied, signing the rental form. "Any tips on where they're biting?" As the men discussed fishing spots, Mr. Henderson's gaze drifted to me. His smile faltered slightly. "Rough night, son?" he asked, his voice lowered. I stared at him, startled by the question. How could he know? "Daniel had a bit of a nightmare," Mom explained. "First night in a strange place." Mr. Henderson nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. "Cabin 7, right?" "Yeah, some folks have trouble sleeping there, especially kids." A chill spread through my chest. "What do you mean?" He seemed to catch himself, glancing at my parents before answering. "Oh, nothing specific. Just that it's one of our more isolated cabins. The forest sounds can be pretty strange if you're not used to them." Dad finished the paperwork and we climbed into the small boat. As Mr. Henderson helped push us off from the dock, he leaned close to me. "If it happens again," he said quietly, "try not reacting. Sometimes attention is what it wants." Before I could ask what he meant, Dad started the motor and we pulled away from the dock. I looked back to see Mr. Henderson watching us, his expression unreadable in the morning light. The fishing trip should have been enjoyable. The lake was calm, the fish were biting, and Dad was in his element showing me how to bait the hook and cast properly. We caught several bass and a good-sized pike, which Dad said we could cook for dinner. But my mind kept returning to Mr. Henderson's words and the events of the night before. What had he meant by attention is what it wants? And who were the some folks who had trouble sleeping in cabin 7? Dad, I said as we drifted in a quiet cove, our lines trailing in the water, has anyone else said weird things happen in our cabin? Dad looked up from adjusting his lure. What? No, of course not. Why would you ask that? Mr. Henderson said people have trouble sleeping there. Dad frowned. He shouldn't be saying things like that to a kid. No wonder you had nightmares. But, no buts, Daniel. There's nothing wrong with the cabin. It's just a building made of wood and nails. And wood makes noise when it expands and contracts with temperature changes. That's all you heard. His tone made it clear the subject was closed. I turned my attention back to my fishing rod, but the seed of doubt had been planted. If there was nothing unusual about cabin 7, why had Mr. Henderson specifically mentioned it? We returned to shore around midday with our catch. Mom had prepared a picnic lunch, which we ate at one of the tables near the lake. Other families were out enjoying the fine weather, swimming, boating, playing frisbee on the narrow strip of beach. Everything seemed so normal, so safe in the daylight. After lunch, we hiked one of the trails that wound through the forest surrounding the lake. The path was well maintained but narrow, forcing us to walk single file in many places. Dad led the way, pointing out interesting plants and the occasional wildlife. Mom followed, taking photographs of particularly scenic spots. I stayed close behind her, unwilling to be last in line with the forest at my back. The trail eventually opened onto a small clearing with a magnificent view of the lake and surrounding mountains. A wooden bench had been placed at the edge of the clearing, offering weary hikers a place to rest and enjoy the vista. Perfect timing, Dad said, checking his watch. We can rest here for a bit before heading back. As my parents sat on the bench admiring the view and consulting the trail map, I wandered around the edge of the clearing. The afternoon sun filtered through the pine branches, creating patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. Despite my lingering unease, the beauty of the place was undeniable. At the far side of the clearing, partially hidden by a large boulder, I found a small wooden structure. At first I thought it was some kind of trail marker or perhaps a birdhouse, but as I drew closer I realized it was a miniature cabin, an exact replica of cabin 7, down to the smallest detail. My heart began to race as I circled the structure. It couldn't be a coincidence. The placement of the windows, the small porch, even the number 7 carved into the tiny door. Everything matched our cabin perfectly. But what truly froze my blood was what I saw when I peered through one of the tiny windows. A small wooden bunk bed, with a minuscule ladder leading to the top bunk. And sitting on that top bunk was a crude wooden figure, roughly the size and shape of an 8-year-old boy. I backed away, stumbling over tree roots in my haste to return to my parents. Mom. Dad, I called, my voice higher than normal. I found something weird. They followed me reluctantly, Mom clearly tired from the hike and Dad checking his watch with increasing frequency. But when I led them to the spot where I'd found the miniature cabin, there was nothing there, just the boulder and undisturbed forest floor. It was right here, I insisted, scanning the ground in disbelief. A tiny cabin that looked exactly like ours. Daniel, Mom said gently, that's enough. We're not playing games right now. I'm not playing. It was here. Dad put his hand on my shoulder, his grip slightly too firm. Son, we're all tired. Let's head back to the real cabin and get some rest before dinner. But no more, Daniel. His voice left no room for argument. The walk back to camp was silent and tense. I knew what I had seen, but I also knew that insisting would only make my parents more dismissive. Instead, I retreated into my thoughts, trying to make sense of everything that had happened since our arrival. The miniature cabin, Mr. Henderson's warning, the climbing sounds on the ladder, they were connected somehow, I was certain of it. But how? And more importantly, what would happen when night fell again? As the afternoon waned, a bank of dark clouds moved in from the west, bringing with them a premature twilight. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the breeze that had been pleasant earlier now carried a damp chill that seemed to seep into my bones. Looks like we might get some rain, Dad observed as we returned to the cabin. Good thing we got our hiking in early. Inside, Mom began preparing dinner, the small space quickly filling with the smell of frying fish and the potatoes she'd brought from home. Dad cleaned our fishing gear on the porch, the door propped open to let in the last of the daylight. I sat at the table, methodically coloring in a page from the activity book Mom had packed, but my attention was constantly drawn to the bunk bed in the corner. In the fading light, the wooden ladder seemed to stand out in stark relief against the shadows, each rung distinct and somehow threatening. "Can I sleep with you guys again tonight?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Mom and Dad exchanged a look. "Daniel," Dad said, setting down the tackle box he'd been organizing, "you're 8 years old. That's too old to be sleeping with your parents because of a bad dream." "It wasn't a dream," I muttered, pressing the crayon so hard against the paper that it snapped. "What was that?" "Nothing." Mom wiped her hands on a dishcloth and came to sit beside me. "Sweetheart, we understand you were scared last night. But sometimes our minds play tricks on us, especially in new places. There's nothing in this cabin that can hurt you. What if I sleep on the bottom bunk with Dad and you take the top bunk?" I suggested desperately. Dad shook his head. "Your mother needs the regular bed for her back, and I'm too big for the top bunk. It has to be you up there." "Or you could sleep on the sofa," Mom offered, glancing at the small two-seater against the wall. It was barely long enough for me, let alone for either of my parents. I nodded quickly. "I'll take the sofa." "Are you sure?" Dad asked, frowning. "It won't be very comfortable." "I'm sure." He sighed, clearly disappointed by what he saw as my childishness, but he didn't argue further. "All right, but just for tonight. Tomorrow you're back in the bunk." Dinner should have been delicious. The fresh fish was perfectly cooked, and Mom had even made her special herb butter to go with the potatoes. But each bite stuck in my throat and I had to force myself to swallow. The approaching night filled me with a dread so profound it was almost physical, a weight pressing down on my chest. Outside, the wind had picked up, driving the first spatters of rain against the cabin windows. The pines swayed and creaked, their shadows dancing across the walls in the lamplight. Every few minutes, thunder rumbled in the distance, drawing steadily closer. "Perfect night for ghost stories," Dad joked as he cleared the dinner plates. Mom shot him a warning look. "James, don't." "What?" "A little scare is part of the camping experience." He winked at me. "Right, buddy?" I nodded mechanically, not wanting to seem even more childish in his eyes. But inside I was screaming. Didn't he understand? The last thing I needed was more fear. As if on cue, lightning flashed, momentarily flooding the cabin with harsh white light. In that instant, I thought I saw something move in the corner near the bunk bed, a shadow that didn't quite match any object in the room, a darkness deeper than mere absence of light. Thunder crashed directly overhead, and the cabin's electricity flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. "Perfect timing," Dad muttered in the sudden darkness. "Everyone stay put. I'll find the flashlights." I heard him moving carefully across the room, bumping into the edge of the table with a muffled curse. Mom's hand found mine in the darkness, her palm cool and reassuring against my sweaty fingers. "It's just a power outage," she whispered. "Nothing to be afraid of." But in the darkness, my other senses seemed heightened. I could smell the lingering aroma of dinner, the mustiness of the sofa cushions, and underneath it all, something else. A faint, sour odor like spoiled meat or stagnant water. Dad's triumphant, "Aha!" preceded the beam of a flashlight cutting through the darkness. He handed another flashlight to Mom and kept the third for himself. The golden circles of light seemed pitifully small against the pressing darkness. "The storm must have knocked out the power," he said, moving to check the circuit breaker on the wall. "Might be out for a while." "Should we go to bed early?" Mom suggested. "There's not much else we can do without electricity." The thought of trying to sleep while that thing, whatever it was, moved freely in the darkness was unbearable. "Can't we play a game or something?" I pleaded. Dad checked his watch, illuminating the face with his flashlight. "It's only 8:30. I guess we could play cards for a bit." We gathered at the table, the 3 flashlights positioned to create a pool of light in the center. Dad dealt a hand of go fish, but my attention kept straying to the edges of the light, where shadows seemed to pulse and shift with a life of their own. The storm intensified, rain now hammering against the roof and windows. Occasionally the wind would gust with such force that the entire cabin would shudder, the timbers groaning in protest. Each time this happened, I would flinch, certain that it was not the wind but something else testing the cabin's strength, looking for a way in. Or perhaps it was already inside. As we played, I became aware of a pattern to the sounds within the cabin. Beneath the storm's fury, there was a subtle rhythm, a soft creak, pause, another creak, pause moving slowly around the perimeter of the room, always just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams. "Dad," I whispered during Mom's turn, "do you hear that?"
Hear what?
He asked, sorting his cards. The creaking. "It's moving around the room." He cocked his head, listening. "It's just the wind, Daniel. Old buildings make noise during storms. But it wasn't the wind. The wind was chaotic, random. This was deliberate, methodical. And it was drawing closer to our table with each circuit of the room." I tried to focus on the game, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my cards. When my turn came, I fumbled the draw, sending cards scattering across the table. "Sorry," I mumbled, gathering them up. As I reached for a card that had fallen to the floor, my flashlight beam swept across the lower portion of the room and I saw them. Footprints. Wet footprints on the wooden floor, leading from the front door to the area behind me. Not human footprints. These were wrong somehow, too long, the toes splayed at impossible angles, the heel narrow and deeply indented. And they glistened in the flashlight beam, not with water but with something darker, more viscous. I scrambled back into my chair, the card forgotten. "There's footprints," I gasped, pointing the flashlight beam toward the floor. "Look!" Mom and Dad both directed their lights where I was pointing, but the floor was empty, just bare wood, dry and unmarked. "Daniel, that's enough," Dad said, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I understand you're scared of the storm, but making things up isn't helping." "I'm not making it up."
They were right there!
"I think it's bedtime," Mom interjected, gathering the cards. "We're all tired and everything seems worse in the dark." Despite my protests, they began preparing for bed. The sofa was made up with sheets and a blanket from the closet, and Mom laid out our clothes for the morning. Dad checked that the door and windows were securely locked, though I noticed he double-checked the door latch. "Try to get some sleep," Mom said, kissing my forehead. "The storm will probably be over by morning." They retreated to their beds, Mom to the queen, Dad to the bottom bunk, leaving me alone on the sofa with my flashlight and racing thoughts. I lay rigid under the blanket, the flashlight clutched so tightly in my hand that my fingers ached. "Mom?" I called softly. "Dad?" "Go to sleep, Daniel," came Dad's gruff reply from the bunk. I wanted to tell them about the footprints, to make them understand that something was in the cabin with us. But the words stuck in my throat. They wouldn't believe me anyway. As I lay there, the storm gradually began to subside. The thunder became more distant. The rain lightened to a gentle patter and the wind dropped to a whisper. Under normal circumstances, these changes would have been comforting. But as the storm quieted, the other sounds became more noticeable. The creaking had stopped its circuit of the room and was now concentrated in one area, the space between the sofa and the front door. Each creak was like a footstep, shifting weight from one foot to another. Waiting. I kept my flashlight trained in that direction, though I wasn't sure I wanted to see what was making the noise. The beam illuminated nothing but empty floor and the edge of the welcome mat by the door. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My parents' breathing had deepened and slowed, indicating they had fallen asleep. The storm had moved on entirely, leaving behind an eerie stillness broken only by the occasional drip of water from the roof. And then, just as my exhausted eyes began to close despite my terror, I heard it again, the laugh. It started as before, a low, gurgling chuckle that seemed to bubble up from some deep, dank place. But this time it didn't stop. It grew, becoming more frenzied, more unhinged with each passing second. It wasn't coming from any specific location anymore, but seemed to fill the entire cabin, reverberating through the walls and floor. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound emerged. My throat had closed in terror, my vocal cords frozen. I could only lie there, paralyzed, as the laughter surrounded me. Then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, expectant, hungry. I heard movement, but not from my parents' beds. Something was moving toward the sofa. Not footsteps exactly, but a sort of wet, sliding sound punctuated by that now familiar creak of weight shifting on old wood. My flashlight beam shook violently as I tried to track the sound, but it revealed nothing. Whatever was approaching was staying just beyond the reach of the light, or perhaps was invisible to it. The sliding, creaking movement stopped directly beside the sofa. I could feel its presence, a cold, heavy weight in the air that smelled of rot and stagnant water. Though I couldn't see it, I knew it was leaning over me, inspecting me with whatever passed for its eyes. A drop of something cold and viscous fell onto my cheek. Then another and another. Not water, it was too thick, too cold. It ran down my face like congealed fat, leaving a trail of numbness wherever it touched. With the last of my strength, I finally managed to scream. My scream shattered the cabin's silence like glass breaking. My parents bolted awake, my father nearly falling from the bottom bunk in his haste. "What? What is it?" he shouted, his voice thick with sleep and alarm. "It's here," I sobbed, scrubbing frantically at my face. "It's right next to me. It's dripping on me." Mom reached the light switch, flipping it uselessly several times before remembering the power was out. "James, check on him," she urged, fumbling for her flashlight. Dad directed his beam toward me, scanning the area around the sofa. "There's nothing here, Daniel. You were having another nightmare." "Feel my face," I insisted, tears streaming down my cheeks. "It was dripping on me." He reluctantly touched my cheek, then pulled his hand away with a frown. "You're just sweating, son. It's warm in here with the power out." "No." I was beyond caring how I sounded now, beyond worrying about appearing childish. "It wasn't sweat. It was cold and thick and wrong." Mom had joined us now, her flashlight adding another beam to the small island of light around the sofa. "James," she said quietly, "look at the floor." Dad directed his beam downward, and I followed suit. There on the wooden floor beside the sofa was a small puddle of something dark and viscous. As we watched, it seemed to shrink, as if being absorbed into the wood itself. "What the hell?" Dad muttered, kneeling for a closer look. He reached out a finger as if to touch it, but Mom grabbed his wrist. "Don't," she whispered. "Please don't touch it." The puddle continued to shrink, the wood darkening as it absorbed the substance. Within seconds, it was gone entirely, leaving only a slightly darker patch on the floor as evidence it had ever existed. Dad stood up slowly, his expression troubled. "It must be a leak from the roof," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. The storm was pretty intense. "James," Mom said, her voice strained, "the roof is not leaking that substance." For the first time, my father seemed at a loss for words. He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the spot where the puddle had been. "I want to leave," I said, my voice small but determined. "Please, can we go home?" Dad sighed deeply. "Daniel, it's the middle of the night. We can't just pack up and leave." "Why not?" Mom asked, surprising us both. "If Daniel is this frightened, maybe we should consider it." "Because it's pouring rain, the roads will be slick and we'd have to pack everything in the dark," Dad listed, gesturing with his flashlight. "It's not practical. We'll discuss it in the morning." "I'm not staying here," I insisted, clutching my blanket around me like armor. "It's going to come back." "What is?" Dad demanded, his patience clearly at an end. "What exactly do you think is in this cabin with us?" I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? How could I describe the presence I felt? The wrongness of that laughter? The impossible weight that seemed to press against reality wherever it moved? "I don't know," I admitted finally. "But it's bad. Really bad." Dad rubbed his face wearily. "Look, I understand you're scared, but there's a rational explanation for everything that's happened. The creaking is the cabin settling. The puddle is a leak we haven't located yet. And the laughter?" He hesitated. "The laughter was probably just the wind through the trees." "It wasn't the wind," I said stubbornly, and it climbed the ladder. "Wood expands and contracts with temperature changes," he explained for what felt like the 100th time. The ladder was creaking because the temperature dropped after we went to bed. Mom placed a hand on his arm. "James, maybe we should—" Whatever she was about to suggest was cut off by a sharp knock at the cabin door. We all froze, flashlight beams converging on the door in perfect synchronicity. The digital clock on Dad's wrist read 2:17 a.m. Who would be knocking at this hour? Mom whispered. Dad handed her his flashlight. "Stay here with Daniel." "James, don't." But he was already moving toward the door, his shoulders squared with determination that couldn't quite mask his unease. He peered through the small window beside the door, then stepped back with a frown. "It's Henderson," he said, sounding surprised. "The camp manager." He unlocked the door and opened it a few inches, keeping his body positioned to block anyone from entering. "Mr. Henderson? Is everything all right?" The man who stood on our porch looked nothing like the friendly camp manager who had greeted us upon arrival. His clothes were disheveled, his hair wild as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. But it was his expression that sent a chill through me, a mixture of fear and grim resignation. "I heard the scream," he said without preamble, "all the way from my cabin." Dad's posture stiffened. "My son had a nightmare. Everything's fine." Henderson's gaze shifted, looking past Dad to where Mom and I huddled on the sofa. His eyes locked with mine, and in that moment I knew with absolute certainty that he understood, that he knew exactly what was happening in Cabin 7. "It wasn't a nightmare," he said quietly. "Was it, son?" Before Dad could respond, Henderson pushed past him into the cabin, closing the door firmly behind him. He moved with a nervous energy, checking the corners of the room with quick, darting glances. "Mr. Henderson," Mom began, "this is highly inappropriate." "You need to leave," he interrupted, his voice low and urgent. "Pack your things and get out now while it's resting." "While what is resting?" Dad demanded, anger beginning to replace his initial shock. "What are you talking about?" Henderson ignored him, addressing me directly. "What did you see?" "What did it do?" I swallowed hard. It laughed, and climbed the ladder the first night. Tonight it was by the sofa. It dripped on me. He nodded as if this confirmed something. "It's escalating faster than usual. You need to go. Now." "Now wait just a minute," Dad interjected, stepping between Henderson and me. "You can't come in here in the middle of the night, frightening my family with this nonsense." "It's not nonsense," Henderson snapped, "and deep down you know that. You saw something on that floor, didn't you? Something that shouldn't exist." Dad's momentary silence was answer enough. "What is it?" Mom asked, her arm tightening around my shoulders. "What's in this cabin?" Henderson ran a hand over his face, suddenly looking much older than he had appeared during our check-in. "I don't know what to call it. Not exactly. But it's been here as long as the campground has existed." "A ghost?" Dad scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. "No." Henderson shook his head firmly. "Not a ghost. Ghosts were once people. This was never human." A profound silence followed his words, broken only by the soft patter of rain on the roof. "Most adults can't perceive it," Henderson continued, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. "Children can, though, especially sensitive ones." He nodded toward me, "Like your boy here." "Why didn't you warn us?" Mom demanded, her voice tight with fear and anger. Henderson's laugh was bitter. "Would you have believed me? Would you have turned around and driven home if I'd told you an ancient, malevolent entity resides in Cabin 7 and has a particular fondness for children? You could have given us a different cabin," Dad pointed out. "They're all booked. Summer season." Henderson's expression darkened. "And it doesn't always manifest. Sometimes months go by without an incident. I hoped." He trailed off, then squared his shoulders. "It doesn't matter what I hoped. You need to leave now. In the middle of the night. In this weather?" Dad gestured toward the window where rain still streaked the glass. "Better than staying here," Henderson insisted. "It's only going to get worse. First night it makes contact. Second night it begins physical manifestation. Third night..." He glanced at me, then apparently thought better of whatever he'd been about to say. "There won't be a third night. Not for your son." Mom stood abruptly. "I'm packing our things. James, get the car ready." To my surprise, Dad didn't argue. The certainty in Henderson's voice, combined with what we'd all witnessed, seemed to have finally broken through his skepticism. "What should we do until we're ready to leave?" he asked Henderson, his voice gruff but no longer challenging. Stay together. Keep the flashlights on. And whatever you do, don't acknowledge it if it returns before you leave. What do you mean, acknowledge it? Mom asked, already gathering our belongings and shoving them haphazardly into bags. Don't look directly at it. Don't speak to it. And for God's sake, don't touch anything it leaves behind. Henderson glanced at the darkened spot on the floor. Attention feeds it, validates it, makes it stronger. I remembered his words from earlier that day. Sometimes attention is what it wants. It made a terrible kind of sense. Dad had begun collecting our fishing gear and other belongings from around the cabin. Why do you stay here? He asked Henderson. If you know what this thing is, why not leave? Henderson's expression was grim. Someone has to warn people. Someone has to try to minimize the damage. He sighed heavily. And it's not just here. If I left, it would eventually follow. These things, they form attachments. A sudden chill swept through the cabin, causing the flashlight beams to waver. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees in an instant, and with it came that smell again. Rot and stagnant water. Stronger now. It's coming back, Henderson whispered, his face paling. Hurry. We moved with frantic energy, throwing our belongings into bags without regard for organization. Dad made 2 trips to the car, loading our gear in the pouring rain while Mom and I finished packing inside, Henderson standing guard at the door. As we worked, the atmosphere in the cabin grew increasingly oppressive. The air felt thick, resistant, as if we were moving through invisible syrup. The smell intensified, and the darkness between our flashlight beams seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Almost done, Mom announced, zipping the last bag. Just need to get our toiletries from the bathroom. I'll get them, I volunteered, wanting to prove my bravery despite my terror. No, Henderson said sharply. Stay where we can see you. But it was too late. I was already halfway to the bathroom door, my flashlight beam bobbing ahead of me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, sweeping the light across the small space. The beam caught something in the mirror above the sink, a reflection that couldn't possibly have been mine. For the briefest instant, I saw a face, if it could be called a face. It had no definable features, just areas of deeper shadow where eyes and mouth should be, all within a roughly head-shaped mass of absolute darkness. I stumbled backward, a scream rising in my throat, but before it could escape, the door slammed shut between me and the others, plunging me into darkness as my flashlight flew from my hand and shattered against the wall. Daniel! I heard my parents shout in unison, their voices muffled by the closed door. Something moved in the darkness with me. I could hear it, that wet, sliding sound accompanied by the creak of weight shifting. It was circling me in the confined space, drawing closer with each revolution. I pressed myself against the door, fumbling desperately for the handle. My fingers closed around it, but it refused to turn. Something on the other side was holding it shut. Mom! Dad! I managed to cry out. Help me! I heard them pounding on the door, trying to force it open. Henderson's voice rose above the commotion. The entity has manifested fully. We need to break down the door. Inside the bathroom, the circling had stopped. Whatever shared the space with me was directly in front of me now. So close I could feel its cold presence against my skin. The smell was overwhelming. No longer just rot and stagnant water, but something far worse. Something ancient and fundamentally wrong. Then came the laugh, that terrible gurgling sound that had haunted my nights. But this time it was followed by words, if they could be called words. The sound was like water forcing its way through mud, each syllable bubbling and distorted. Found. You... The doorknob suddenly gave way beneath my hand, and I fell backward as my father and Henderson burst into the bathroom. Dad scooped me up immediately, cradling me against his chest as he backed away. Henderson wielded a large flashlight like a weapon, sweeping its beam around the small space. Where is it? He demanded. Did you see it? I could only point mutely at the area in front of where I had been standing. There was nothing visible there now, but the air seemed to warp slightly, like heat rising from pavement on a summer day. Get him out of here, Henderson ordered. Get in your car and drive. Don't stop until you're miles away from Shady Pines. What about you? Mom asked, already guiding us toward the cabin door. Henderson's smile was grim. I'll handle things here. I always do. We didn't wait for further explanation. Dad carried me to the car, Mom following with the last of our bags. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, but lightning still flickered on the horizon, illuminating the campground in brief, harsh flashes. As Dad started the engine, I looked back at cabin 7. Henderson stood on the porch watching us. But he wasn't alone. A deeper shadow stood beside him, a darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it, vaguely human-shaped but wrong in fundamental ways. "Dad," I whispered. "It's there." On the porch with Mr. Henderson. Dad didn't look back. He put the car in gear and accelerated down the gravel road, tires spitting stones behind us. "Don't look at it, Daniel," he said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Remember what Henderson said. Don't acknowledge it." I tore my gaze away from the cabin, focusing instead on the road ahead as we passed through the campground gates and onto the main highway. Only when we were several miles away, the campground long lost to the darkness behind us, did any of us speak again. "Are we safe now?" I asked, my voice small in the car's quiet interior. Mom reached back from the passenger seat to squeeze my hand. "Yes, sweetheart. We're safe now." But even as she spoke, I noticed Dad checking the rearview mirror more often than necessary, his expression tense, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us, not physically, perhaps, but in some other more insidious way. A memory had attached itself to us, a knowledge that couldn't be unlearned, and in that knowledge lay a terrible vulnerability, as if by perceiving the thing in cabin 7, we had somehow opened ourselves to it. I huddled in the back seat, watching the rain-slicked road disappear beneath our tires, and wondered if we would ever truly escape what we had encountered at Shady Pines. We drove through the remainder of the night, stopping only when the gas gauge dipped dangerously low. Dad pulled into a brightly lit service station around 5 a.m. The fluorescent lights a blessed relief after hours of darkness, broken only by our headlights and the occasional flash of distant lightning. While Dad filled the tank, Mom took me inside to use the bathroom. The normalcy of the convenience store was jarring after our experience. The bored cashier flipping through a magazine, the hum of refrigerator cases, the tinny music playing over ceiling speakers. It felt like we had stepped back into the real world after visiting somewhere else entirely, somewhere the usual rules didn't apply. "Are you hungry?" Mom asked, her voice carefully neutral as we browsed the snack aisle. She was trying so hard to act normal, to pretend we were just a family on an early morning road trip. I shook my head. The thought of food made my stomach turn. Every few minutes I would catch myself checking over my shoulder, scanning shadowy corners with wary eyes. The fluorescent lights left no place for darkness to hide, but that didn't stop me from looking. When we returned to the car, Dad was already behind the wheel, staring straight ahead with an unfocused gaze that suggested his thoughts were far away. He started slightly when Mom opened the passenger door. "All set?" he asked, his voice rough with fatigue. Mom nodded, passing him a large coffee she'd bought inside. "Where are we heading?" "Home," he said simply. "We can be there by noon if the traffic's light." None of us mentioned Shady Pines or the abrupt end to our vacation. It was as if we had made an unspoken agreement not to discuss what had happened until we were safely home. As if talking about it might somehow summon it back to us. I must have fallen asleep eventually, lulled by the car's motion and the absolute exhaustion of fear. When I awoke, we were pulling into our driveway, the familiar sight of our house bringing tears to my eyes. "We're home," Mom said softly, reaching back to touch my knee. "Everything's going to be okay now." But was it? Could things ever really be okay again after what we had experienced? I wasn't sure. The rest of that day passed in a fog. We unpacked the car mechanically, putting away our belongings without comment. None of us mentioned the items we'd left behind in our haste to escape. Dad's favorite fishing rod, Mom's novel, my action figures. They seemed a small price to pay for our safety. That night, as bedtime approached, a new fear gripped me. Would it be waiting for me in my bedroom? Had it somehow followed us home? Hidden in the shadows of our car or in the darker corners of our memories? "Can I sleep with you tonight?" I asked Mom as she tucked me into my own bed, my voice small but determined. She hesitated, glancing toward the hallway where Dad was preparing for bed in their room. "Daniel," she began gently, "you're safe here. This is our home." Nothing from that place can reach you here. Please, I whispered, hating the tears that sprang to my eyes but unable to stop them. Just for tonight. She sighed, then nodded. All right. Just for tonight. I slept between my parents that night and for several nights afterward. Dad didn't object as I had expected him to. Something had changed in him since our experience at Shady Pines. A certainty had been shaken. A fundamental confidence in the orderliness of the world. Weeks passed, and gradually we established a new normal. During the day, it was almost possible to believe that nothing extraordinary had happened. We went about our routines, school for me, work for my parents. We laughed at dinner, watched television in the evenings, did all the ordinary things that families do. But the nights remained difficult. I developed elaborate bedtime rituals, checking under the bed and in the closet, leaving the hallway light on, positioning my stuffed animals in a protective circle around my pillow. Mom and Dad indulged these behaviors without comment, perhaps understanding that they were my way of regaining some sense of control. Dad researched Shady Pines campground online, though he tried to hide this from me. I caught glimpses of his computer screen sometimes, forum posts from other campers, historical records of the area, old newspaper articles. I never asked what he found, and he never volunteered the information. Mom became jumpier, startling at unexpected sounds and keeping lights on throughout the house well into the night. She began sleeping with a small lamp on her bedside table, something she had never done before. As for me, I developed a heightened awareness of darkness. Not just the absence of light, but the quality of shadows, the weight of them. I could sense the difference between ordinary darkness and something else, something watching, waiting. I learned to trust this awareness, to respect it. About a month after our return, I woke in the middle of the night to find my room colder than usual. The digital clock on my bedside table read 3:17 a.m. What I would later learn is called the dead hour, when the veil between worlds is supposedly at its thinnest. My nightlight cast a weak glow across the room, barely penetrating the shadows that gathered in the corners. As I lay there fully awake and instantly alert, I became aware of a presence not in my room but nearby. Somewhere in our house something was moving. I slipped out of bed and padded to my bedroom door, pressing my ear against it. The hallway beyond was silent, but it was a silence that felt expectant, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Slowly, carefully, I turned the doorknob and eased the door open a crack. The hallway was dark except for the faint glow from the bathroom nightlight at the far end. Nothing moved in that limited field of view, but the feeling of a presence remained stronger now. I should have been terrified. After what had happened at Shady Pines, any hint of that supernatural darkness should have sent me running to my parents' room. But something was different this time. The presence didn't feel threatening. It felt protective. With a courage I didn't know I possessed, I opened the door wider and stepped into the hallway. The temperature dropped noticeably, my breath fogging slightly in the chill air. At the end of the hall, a shadow moved, not the amorphous, consuming darkness from the cabin, but something more defined, more purposeful. It was roughly the shape of a man, tall and broad-shouldered. As I watched, it turned toward me, though I couldn't make out any features in the gloom. For a long moment, we regarded each other across the length of the hallway. Then it raised. A hand, a clear gesture of reassurance or farewell, and faded into the darkness. The next morning, we received a letter. There was no return address, but the postmark was from the town nearest to Shady Pines. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message written in a shaky hand. "It won't bother you again. I've made sure of that. But be cautious in dark places. Once you've seen them, they can sometimes see you too. G.H." Dad read the note 3 times, then silently passed it to Mom. Neither of them explained it to me, but they didn't need to. I understood that G.H. was Gerald Henderson, the camp manager who had helped us escape. What I didn't understand until years later was the sacrifice his message implied. That was the last direct contact we had with anything related to Shady Pines, but the experience left its mark on all of us. Dad became more open-minded about things he couldn't explain. Mom developed an interest in protective folklore and filled our house with subtle wardings, horseshoes over doorways, bundles of herbs hung in windows, lines of salt on windowsills that she would replace monthly. As for me, I never again slept on the top bunk of a bunk bed. Even now as an adult, I can't bring myself to climb those wooden ladders. The sound of them creaking under weight is enough to send ice through my veins. But I gained something too, an awareness of the world beyond the visible, beyond the explainable. Most people go through life never encountering the darker truths that exist in the shadows. I sometimes envy them their innocence, but I can't regret the knowledge. It has made me cautious but not fearful, respectful of darkness but not ruled by it. And on certain nights when the wind sounds like laughter and shadows seem deeper than they should be, I sense that protective presence again, a guardian standing between me and whatever waits in the darkness. I don't know if it's Henderson or something else entirely, but I'm grateful for it nonetheless. Some experiences change you forever. What happened at Shady Pines Campground in the summer of 2010 was such an experience for me. It opened my eyes to a reality most people never glimpse, and while that vision came with a burden of fear, it also came with a deeper understanding of the world and its mysteries. I've never returned to Shady Pines, and I never will. Some places should be left alone, their secrets undisturbed. But I've made my peace with what happened there, and with the knowledge that the world is stranger and more dangerous than most people realize. The darkness taught me to fear, but it also taught me to survive. And in the end, that's the most important lesson of all. I'm 23 now, sitting in my apartment with the lights on despite the late hour. Outside, rain taps against the windows and thunder rumbles in the distance. Storms still make me uneasy, though I've learned to manage the anxiety they provoke. My laptop is open before me, the screen displaying the website I've been monitoring for months. Shady Pines Campground closed permanently, the headline announces. The article beneath it cites declining tourism and maintenance issues as the reasons for the closure, but I know better. I click through to another tab where I've compiled news reports spanning the 15 years since our family's experience. Disappearances mostly. Campers who wandered off and were never found. Children who vanished from tents and cabins only to turn up miles away with no memory of how they'd gotten there. And deaths, too few to establish a pattern that might attract serious investigation, but too many for coincidence. And always in the background of these stories, brief mentions of the camp manager who'd worked at Shady Pines for over 30 years. Gerald Henderson, described by all as helpful, concerned, somehow always first on the scene when things went wrong. Until 3 months ago when Henderson himself disappeared. The official report says he went fishing on the lake and never returned. His boat was found drifting empty, no sign of struggle or accident. The authorities concluded he had fallen, overboard and drowned, though his body was never recovered. I know different. The letter I received the week after his disappearance confirmed what I had suspected. It's done, the note read in that same shaky handwriting. Cabin 7 is empty now. I've taken it with me, as far from others as I can. Don't come looking. Live well. G.H. My phone rings, startling me from my thoughts. It's Dad calling much later than he usually would. Did you see the news? He asks without preamble when I answer. About Shady Pines? Yes. A long pause follows, filled with the static of unsaid things. My parents and I have never fully discussed what happened that summer. We've referenced it obliquely over the years, acknowledging its impact on our lives without examining the details too closely. Do you think it's really over? Dad finally asks, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of unanswered questions. I think Henderson made sure of it, I reply. Another pause, shorter this time. Your mother wants to know if you're still coming for dinner this weekend. The abrupt change of subject is so typical of my father that I almost laugh. Yes, I'll be there. Tell her I'm bringing dessert. Good, that's good. He clears his throat. Daniel, are you? Do you ever? I'm fine, Dad, I say gently, understanding the question he can't quite formulate. I haven't had the dreams in years. This isn't entirely true. The nightmares still come occasionally. Dark shapes climbing wooden ladders, wet footprints on hardwood floors, laughter that bubbles up from impossibly deep places. But they're just echoes now, memories rather than visitations. Good, Dad says again. That's good. Well, we'll see you Sunday. After we hang up, I return to my research. It's become something of an obsession over the years. Not just Shady Pines, but other places like it. Places where the veil between worlds is thin, where things that shouldn't exist find ways to touch our reality. I've documented dozens of such locations across the country. Abandoned buildings where shadows move against the light, stretches of forest where hikers report time distortions, hotel rooms where guests wake to find themselves watched by things that retreat into walls at the first sign of acknowledgement. My research has brought me into contact with others who have had similar experiences, people who have glimpsed the darkness and lived to remember it. We share information, warnings, methods of protection. We've formed a loose network of watchers, cataloging incursions and keeping track of patterns. It was through this network that I learned of Henderson's final plan. He'd been containing the entity in Cabin 7 for decades, binding it through means he never fully explained to anyone. But he was growing old, his strength failing, and he knew he couldn't maintain the binding much longer. So he made a choice, the only choice that would ensure the safety of others. He lured the entity onto the lake to the very center where the water runs deepest, and he took it down with him into the darkness, a final sacrifice to end a lifetime of guardianship. The storm outside intensifies, lightning flashing in rapid succession. I close my laptop and move to the window, watching raindrops race down the glass. In their trails, I can almost see patterns forming, meaningful arrangements just beyond my comprehension. This is what remains of my experience at Shady Pines, not fear, but awareness. An understanding that reality has depths most people never plumb, currents that move beneath the surface of normal perception. I turn from the window and methodically check the apartment. Doors locked, salt lines intact on the windowsills, protective symbols subtly incorporated into the decor, not out of fear but out of respect for what I know exists. As I prepare for bed, I think of Henderson and hope that whatever peace is possible has found him. I think of my parents who learned to accept a world broader and stranger than they had believed possible. And I think of my 8-year-old self, terrified on a top bunk as something climbed toward me in the darkness. We survived, all of us. Changed, certainly, marked in ways that can never be erased, but we survived. I switch off the bedside lamp but leave the hallway light on, a concession to old habits. As darkness fills the room, I sense rather than see the now familiar presence take up its station in the corner. My guardian, my protector, following me from home to college to this small apartment. Good night, I whisper to the darkness, and in the silence that follows, I find comfort rather than fear. Some battles continue long after the initial conflict ends. Some enemies never fully retreat, but I've learned that the same is true of allies, of the forces that stand against the darkness. As I drift towards sleep, I carry this knowledge with me like a talisman. Darkness exists, but it does not rule unchallenged. And those who have seen it, who have named it and survived it, are never truly alone in their vigilance. This is the legacy of Cabin 7. This is what remains when terror fades and wisdom takes root. This is how I live now, eyes open, mind aware, spirit unbowed by the weight of knowing. In the hallway beyond my bedroom door, a floorboard creaks softly. I smile into the darkness and close my eyes. It was early 1998, in a newer subdivision near Granite Ridge just north of Phoenix, Arizona. Our home was practically developed right over fresh desert, with imposing rocky peaks looming in the near distance. The desert was federal land, and at the time venturing back there was strictly prohibited. But I was a restless 16-year-old sophomore in high school, and rules meant little to me then. I spent countless afternoons riding my bike through the forbidden terrain, exploring every crevice and formation with reckless abandon. The arid landscape, with its stark beauty and hidden dangers, called to something primal within me. I collected desert specimens, scorpions in jars, shed snakeskins, unique rocks, displaying them proudly in my bedroom like trophies. Soon after moving there, I befriended Brendan, who lived about 2 miles away across from another section of the protected desert. We quickly bonded over our shared fascination with the forbidden territory. Together we discovered a particular area where an alcove had formed in the peak side, a natural shelter that became our secret hideout. We'd bring sodas, comics, and sometimes cigarettes stolen from Brendan's older brother, feeling invincible in our desert sanctuary. Only now, looking back, do I realize how dangerously naive we were. The desert harbored countless threats: rattlesnakes coiled beneath rocks, scorpions lurking in shadowed crevices, and jumping cacti whose barbed spines could embed in flesh like serrated hooks. The wildlife wasn't our only concern. One sweltering afternoon, while exploring a dry wash, we encountered two men in a rusted pickup truck. They stopped abruptly when they spotted my bike blocking their path. The driver, his face weathered and hostile, leaned out of the window. "Move that piece of junk before I flatten it," he growled, engine revving menacingly. "And you too with it." Brendan and I exchanged terrified glances, saying nothing as we hurriedly dragged my bike out of their way. The truck roared past, kicking up a cloud of dust that stung our eyes and throats. Neither of us spoke about it afterward, but a palpable tension had entered our desert adventures. Despite these dangers, we continued our reckless behavior. We would climb to precarious heights and dislodge massive boulders, watching with primitive delight as they crashed down the hillside, shattering smaller rocks and uprooting cacti. The thunderous sound of destruction echoed through the valley, and we felt powerful, untouchable. I kept a slingshot in my back pocket, using it to ricochet small stones against rock formations, desert flora, and occasionally abandoned cans or bottles left by other trespassers. The sharp crack of stone against stone became our desert soundtrack, a persistent challenge to the silence that otherwise dominated the landscape. In the summer of 1999, Brendan's family relocated to Florida. For weeks I avoided our hideout, the alcove seeming unnaturally empty without his presence. Eventually, however, the desert's pull proved too strong, and I began venturing out alone. The solitude transformed my experience. Without Brendan's constant chatter, I became aware of sounds I'd previously ignored. The whisper of wind through rock crevices, the distant cry of a hawk, the subtle shifting of sand beneath lizards' feet. Sometimes, in the profound stillness, I could swear something else moved just beyond my field of vision, something that retreated whenever I turned to look. During one particularly hot afternoon in July, I decided to collect some jumping cacti to plant along our property line. We had increasingly problematic neighbors. A middle-aged man named Johnson and his teenage sons, who were engaged in an ongoing dispute with the homeowners association over unauthorized solar panel installations. Their frustration frequently manifested in petty vandalism, graffiti on community fences, damaged mailboxes, and other nuisance behaviors. My adolescent mind conceived a simple deterrent: planting the vicious jumping cacti underneath the fence line separating our properties. Anyone attempting to climb over would receive a painful surprise. As I carefully gathered several cactus specimens using 2 sticks as makeshift tongs, an unnatural sound cut through the desert silence, the distinctive whipping of helicopter blades. I glanced up to see a black unmarked helicopter hovering unnervingly close. No identification markers, no visible pilot, just a dark mechanical intruder against the azure sky. An overwhelming sense of dread seized me. Every instinct screamed danger. Abandoning my cactus collection, I leapt onto my bike and pedaled frantically toward home, more than a mile away. The helicopter maintained its position initially, then began moving in my direction with deliberate slowness. By the time I reached our backyard, sweat drenched my clothes and my lungs burned with each breath. Desperate to cool down, I plunged my head into our pool, the sudden cold a shock against my overheated skin. As water dripped from my hair, the unmistakable sound returned. The helicopter now hovered directly above our house. I continued petting our German shepherd, Rusty with deliberate casualness, refusing to look upward. The dog's ears flattened against his head, his body tense against mine. For several agonizing minutes the helicopter remained, before finally departing toward the direction of Luke Air Force Base, where we knew they maintained a shooting range beyond the desert area. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I lay in bed, strange shadows seemed to gather in the corners of my room, dispersing whenever I turned to look directly at them. I fell into a restless sleep, filled with fractured dreams of pursuing figures and incomprehensible whispers. The helicopter incident marked the beginning of a disturbing pattern. In the weeks that followed, I experienced increasingly alarming sleep disturbances. I would jolt awake in the middle of the night, disoriented and terrified, often finding myself in bizarre positions, standing beside my bed, crouched in a corner or once inexplicably, atop my dresser. More disturbing were the violent episodes. On multiple occasions, I regained consciousness while violently swinging my pillow at unseen assailants, my heart racing and adrenaline coursing through my veins. During these episodes, I would briefly glimpse shadowy forms or misty apparitions that vanished the moment I became fully aware. My parents attributed these incidents to normal teenage stress, suggesting that upcoming college applications and my recent breakup with my girlfriend were manifesting in strange sleep behaviors. I wanted to believe them, but something deeper told me these explanations were inadequate. After graduating high school in 2000, I enrolled in a graphic design program at a technical college in Tempe, Arizona. The early classes required me to leave home well before dawn, and I developed a habit of napping in my car in the school parking lot before classes began. One frigid January morning, I awoke in my car to the distinct sensation of being observed. Opening my eyes, I saw a dark figure standing beside my driver's side window, its features obscured by the early morning gloom. A surge of terror paralyzed me. I tried to scream, but my vocal cords refused to cooperate. I attempted to move my arm toward the knife I kept in the side door compartment, but my limbs felt leaden, immovable. My eyelids grew inexplicably heavy, closing against my will. For what seemed like an eternity, I remained trapped in this paralysis, aware but unable to act. When I finally broke free of the invisible restraint, the figure had vanished and the parking lot was bathed in the normal pink glow of early sunrise. Several other students had arrived, going about their morning routines with casual normalcy. I spent the day in a fog, unable to focus on my classes. That night I researched sleep paralysis, finding some comfort in the scientific explanation for my experience. Yet the memory of that dark figure remained vivid, refusing to be categorized as a mere hypnagogic hallucination. After completing my degree in 2002, I returned to Washington State, where I had spent my childhood years and where my parents had relocated during my college studies. The familiar landscape of evergreen forests and perpetual mist should have provided comfort after the harsh desert environment. But my sleep disturbances continued. The shadowy visitations became less frequent but more intense. Instead of vague apparitions, I now encountered more defined presences, darker, more substantial, and seemingly conscious. These entities would hover at the foot of my bed or in doorways, observing me with an intelligence that felt malevolent and calculated. In late 2002, I met Veronica, a flight attendant whose warmth and practical nature provided an anchor during this turbulent period. We married in May 2003, and for a brief time the disturbances subsided. I dared to hope that whatever had followed me from the desert had finally relinquished its hold. Veronica occasionally witnessed my strange sleep behaviors. She described incidents where I would sit upright in bed, eyes wide but unseeing, speaking in guttural sounds that resembled no language she recognized. During these episodes, she would gently guide me back to a lying position, and I would comply without resistance. Never remembering these incidents the following morning, we laughed about these occurrences over breakfast, dismissing them as harmless somnambulism. "You were speaking in tongues again last night," she would tease, pouring coffee. "Should I be worried you're possessed?" I laughed along, but privately, her descriptions disturbed me deeply. The idea that something could control my body without my knowledge or consent planted a seed of fear that would soon blossom into terror. In December 2003, Veronica's airline transferred her to Austin, Texas. We relocated, finding a rustic cedar cabin for rent in Smithville, about 30 miles southeast of the city. The isolated property, surrounded by dense pine forest, seemed idyllic after years of suburban living. The cabin itself was charming if somewhat dilapidated, a single-story structure with a small kitchen, living area, bedroom, and bathroom. Previous tenants had left behind various decorative items, including a plaster statue of Apollo that we placed on a shelf in the living room. Veronica's schedule often kept her away until the early morning hours. leaving me alone in the cabin for long stretches. At first, I welcomed the solitude, using the time to develop my freelance graphic design portfolio. But as winter deepened, the isolation began to feel oppressive. Strange sounds became commonplace, creaking floorboards when I was the only one home, scratching noises from inside the walls, the sensation of footsteps following behind me as I moved through the cabin. I attributed these phenomena to the structure's age and the surrounding wildlife, but doubt gnawed at me. My sleep disturbances returned with increased intensity. I would wake to find myself in unusual locations, standing in the yard at midnight, huddled in the shower fully clothed, or once, terrifyingly, perched on the cabin's roof with no memory of how I'd climbed there. Veronica grew concerned, suggesting I consult a sleep specialist. I agreed, but appointments were scheduled months out due to the rural location. In the meantime, I began recording myself sleeping using a video camera borrowed from a friend. The footage revealed nothing unusual, just my restless turning and occasional mumbling, until the night of June 17, 2004. That evening began normally enough. I closed at my design job around 9 p.m. and returned to the cabin, where I microwaved leftover pasta and opened a beer. Veronica had texted earlier to say her flight was delayed, so she wouldn't be home until after 2 a.m. I spent a few hours working on a logo design while listening to music, eventually falling asleep on the couch around 11:30 p.m. What happened next exists in my memory as a series of fractured images and sensations, supplemented by Veronica's terrified account. According to her, she arrived home at approximately 2:30 a.m. As she approached the cabin, she heard what sounded like multiple large dogs circling the structure, their growls low and threatening. Alarmed, she hurried inside, locking the door behind her. The interior was pitch black, but the growling hadn't ceased. Instead, it now emanated from our bedroom. Heart pounding, she moved cautiously down the hallway, calling my name softly. When no response came, she pushed open the bedroom door. The sight that greeted her defies rational explanation. I stood atop our bed, my body contorted into an impossible position, spine arched backward at an inhuman angle. My jaw hung open unnaturally wide, and my eyes, according to Veronica, had transformed into bottomless black pits. Initially assuming I was experiencing another sleepwalking episode, she approached to guide me back to bed as she had done countless times before. "Honey," she called softly, "you're dreaming again. Let's get you lying down." What happened next nearly cost her life. With a movement too quick to follow, I launched myself at her, hands closing around her throat with inhuman strength. She described looking into my face and seeing nothing of the person she knew, only a malevolent entity using my body as its vessel. Fighting for her life, she kicked and struck at me repeatedly, yet I showed no reaction to blows that should have caused significant pain. Her screams echoed through the cabin as she called my name desperately, hoping to reach whatever remained of my consciousness. "This isn't you," she cried between gasps for air. "Fight it. Come back to me." From my perspective, I experienced this event as though trapped behind a veil, aware but unable to control my actions. I could see my hands choking my wife, could hear her desperate pleas, but remained powerless to stop myself. Something else occupied my body, using my strength for its malevolent purpose. The bedroom door, which had been open when Veronica entered, slammed shut with violent force despite neither of us being near it. Our cat Saber, normally affectionate and calm, raced around the room in frantic circles, yowling in apparent terror. After what seemed an eternity but was likely only minutes, I felt the foreign presence beginning to weaken. With immense effort, I fought to reclaim control of my body. The struggle manifested physically. My limbs trembled violently, my head jerked from side to side, and from my throat came sounds no human should be capable of producing. The noise that emerged can only be described as a demonic screeching, multi-tonal and layered, as though multiple entities were screaming simultaneously. The sound was so horrific that Veronica later said it affected her on a physical level, causing nausea and disorientation. When I finally managed to speak, intending to reassure Veronica that I was regaining control, my voice emerged distorted and deepened to an impossible register. "It's okay now," I attempted to say, but the words came out warped and threatening. "No," Veronica whispered, backing away. "It's not you." Gradually, the presence receded completely, leaving me exhausted and trembling. As full awareness returned, the horror of what had just occurred hit me with devastating force. I had nearly killed the woman I loved while some unknown entity controlled my actions. We spent the remainder of the night huddled together in the living room, lights blazing, too terrified to return to the bedroom. Sleep was impossible. Instead, we prayed fervently, a significant act for me, as I had long considered faith pointless and prayer futile. In that moment of absolute terror, however, I found myself begging for divine protection with genuine desperation. Morning brought no relief. As I stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper, an unnatural cold enveloped me despite the June heat. The hair on my neck and arms stood on end, and an overwhelming sensation of being watched permeated the air. Something hostile lingered just beyond perception, radiating malice. Veronica, still shaken from the night's events, drove to a nearby Catholic church, returning with holy water that she sprinkled throughout the cabin. I watched in silence, no longer skeptical of such protective measures. We also placed small crosses above doorways and windows, anything that might prevent another incident. For 2 weeks, an uneasy calm prevailed. I slept fitfully but experienced no further episodes of sleepwalking or possession. Veronica and I rarely discussed what had happened, as though verbalizing the experience might somehow invite its return. Then, on a night when Veronica worked a late flight, I awoke suddenly around 3 a.m. with the distinct sensation of being observed. Opening my eyes, I saw the Apollo statue we'd placed in the living room, now standing inexplicably on my bedside table. More disturbing were its eyes. Once merely painted plaster, they now glowed with an eerie blue luminescence. My initial thought was that moonlight was creating the effect. To test this theory, I grabbed the statue and carried it to the bathroom, the darkest room in the cabin with no windows. Even there, in complete darkness, the eyes continued their supernatural glow. A primal fear urged me to destroy the object, but some instinct warned against it. Instead, I placed the statue on the floor and covered it completely with a thick blanket before returning to bed. Sleep evaded me for the remainder of the night as I listened to subtle movements from beneath the blanket. Slight scraping sounds, as though the statue shifted position incrementally. At dawn, I retrieved the statue, finding its eyes once again inert. I drove to a remote location miles from our cabin and buried the object deep in the woods, marking the spot with a stone cairn to ensure I never accidentally unearthed it. Upon returning home, I realized something had fundamentally changed. The oppressive atmosphere that had lingered since moving to the cabin had lifted. For the first time in months, I could breathe freely within those cedar walls. The events in that Texas cabin marked the end of my supernatural torment. After disposing of the Apollo statue, the nocturnal disturbances ceased entirely. No more ghostly clouds hovering above my bed, no more speaking in unknown languages during sleep, no more waking in inexplicable locations. Yet while the paranormal activity concluded, its effects on my life continued to ripple outward. My relationship with Veronica, once strong and supportive, began deteriorating in subtle ways. The traumatic experience had created a fracture between us that widened with passing time. Though we had 2 children in the years that followed, our marriage couldn't withstand the strain of shared trauma. We divorced in 2012 after 9 years together. In my current home, I occasionally experience phenomena that might suggest a paranormal presence. Knocking sounds from empty rooms, objects relocated without explanation, sudden cold spots in otherwise warm areas. However, these occurrences lack the malevolence that characterized my earlier experiences. Whatever entity now shares my space seems content with minor mischief rather than outright torment. In 2010, I consulted with paranormal researchers who suggested a disturbing theory about my experiences. They believed my teenage activities in the Arizona desert, the destructive boulder rolling, the ricochet of stones against sacred formations, the general disrespect for an ancient landscape, may have attracted a malevolent entity known in Navajo tradition as a skinwalker. According to their theory, this entity attached itself to me during those formative years, gradually strengthening its connection until it could influence my unconscious mind and, eventually, attempt complete possession. The Apollo statue, they suggested, may have served as a conduit or vessel, explaining why its disposal marked the end of the more violent manifestations. I remain skeptical of this specific explanation, but I cannot deny the reality of what I experienced. Something beyond scientific understanding targeted me, nearly destroyed my marriage, and fundamentally altered my perception of reality. My worldview has shifted dramatically since those terrifying years. While I still avoid organized religion, I maintain a profound belief in forces beyond human comprehension and the importance of respecting spaces and energies we don't fully understand. I've learned that genuine terror often stems not from the supernatural itself, but from the realization that our understanding of reality is incomplete and fragile. For those who have never experienced such phenomena, these accounts may seem like fabrications or the delusions of an unstable mind. Before my experiences began, I too would have dismissed such stories. Now I understand that some truths can only be learned through direct experience, no matter how unwilling the student. I share this account not to convince skeptics or seek validation, but as a warning. There exist in this world boundaries that should not be crossed and ancient forces that should not be disturbed. My reckless teenage explorations awakened something that hunted me across thousands of miles and nearly claimed my life. Sometimes, lying awake at night, I wonder if it truly abandoned its pursuit or merely retreated temporarily. Perhaps it waits still, gathering strength for another attempt. This uncertainty is the final horror of my experience, knowing that some doors, once opened, can never be truly closed again. The summer of 2019 changed everything for me. I was 15 then, eager to attend what seemed like the perfect summer camp. Pine Ridge Safety Camp promised adventure, learning, and unforgettable memories. Located deep in the Oregon wilderness, surrounded by dense forests and isolated from civilization, the camp specialized in teaching teenagers essential survival and safety skills. My parents had enrolled me after hearing about the program's stellar reputation. Real police officers would train us, firefighters would demonstrate rescue techniques, and we'd even witness emergency helicopter demonstrations. The brochure showed smiling teenagers learning CPR, practicing wilderness navigation, and building confidence through challenging outdoor activities. The first week exceeded my expectations. Officer Rodriguez taught us self-defense techniques, while Sergeant Mitchell demonstrated proper emergency response protocols. The helicopter arrival was spectacular. A massive rescue chopper landing in the center of our camp, its rotors creating a windstorm that bent the surrounding trees. The pilot, Captain Stevens, showed us the intricate rescue equipment and explained life-saving procedures. My cabin mates were friendly enough. Ryan, a quiet kid from Portland, Danny, an energetic 14-year-old from Seattle, and Jerome, a tall, lanky boy who seemed perpetually nervous. We shared stories, played cards, and bonded over our shared excitement about the camp's activities. The counselors maintained strict schedules. Lights out at 10:30 p.m. sharp, with bathroom visits supervised after 10 p.m. Our cabin leader, Brandon, was a former military man in his early 20s who took safety protocols seriously. He'd patrol the cabin area regularly, ensuring we followed all rules and stayed within designated boundaries. But even during those first pleasant days, I noticed something unsettling about the camp's atmosphere after dark. The woods seemed to press closer to our cabins, and strange sounds would echo through the forest. Not animal sounds, but something else entirely. The other campers dismissed my concerns, attributing them to typical wilderness noises and my overactive imagination. By the second week, our nightly routine had become mechanical. After evening activities and campfire stories, we'd return to our cabins for personal hygiene and preparation for bed. The bathroom facility was a separate building, approximately 50 yards from our cabin, connected by a dimly lit gravel path. The bathroom building itself was unnerving. Built in the 1960s, it featured concrete walls, fluorescent lighting that flickered intermittently, and a constant musty smell that seemed to seep from the very foundation. The main area contained 6 sinks with cracked mirrors, while the back section housed shower stalls and toilet facilities. The building's design created multiple blind spots and acoustic dead zones where sound seemed to disappear entirely. That particular Tuesday night, August 13th, I was running late for the bathroom routine. While my cabin mates had already completed their preparations, I had been delayed by a lengthy phone call with my parents. Brandon granted me permission to visit the bathroom facility, but warned me to be quick and return directly to the cabin. Ryan and Danny decided to accompany me, claiming they needed to brush their teeth again. Jerome opted to stay behind, already nestled in his sleeping bag and complaining of a headache. Looking back, I wonder if Jerome sensed something the rest of us couldn't, some primal instinct warning him to stay away from that building that night. The walk to the bathroom felt different than usual. The camp's outdoor lighting seemed dimmer, casting longer shadows between the buildings. Our footsteps on the gravel path sounded unnaturally loud, echoing off the surrounding structures. Even the typical forest sounds, crickets, rustling leaves, distant owl calls, seemed muted, as if nature itself was holding back. Inside the bathroom, the fluorescent lights buzzed more aggressively than normal, creating an unsettling strobe effect. The mirrors reflected our faces strangely, making us appear older and more haggard than we actually were. Danny commented on the unusual silence, noting that even the building's ventilation system seemed to have stopped working. As I stood at the sink, mechanically brushing my teeth, I became aware of an unusual sound emanating from the shower area. Initially, I assumed it was water pipes settling, or perhaps the old building's ventilation system malfunctioning. But as I continued listening, the sound took on a more disturbing quality. It was singing, definitely human singing, coming from the shower stalls. The voice was deep, masculine, and carried an eerily melodic quality that seemed to reverberate off the concrete walls. The song itself was unrecognizable, not any tune I'd ever heard before. The words were indistinct, almost mumbled, but the melody was clear and deeply unsettling. What made the situation particularly disturbing was the complete absence of running water. The shower area had been officially closed for maintenance since the previous day, with yellow caution tape blocking the entrance. No legitimate reason existed for anyone to be in that section of the building, especially not at this hour. Ryan and Danny had noticed the singing too. We exchanged concerned glances in the cracked mirror, our toothbrushes suspended mid-motion. The singing continued, sometimes growing louder, sometimes fading to barely audible whispers. The voice seemed to move between the shower stalls, suggesting the person was walking back and forth in the restricted area. Maybe it's just someone who didn't know about the maintenance closure, Danny whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. We all knew the camp's strict protocols about restricted areas, and any counselor or staff member would have been informed about the shower closure. The singing took on a more disturbing quality, repetitive phrases that seemed to loop endlessly. The voice would hit certain notes that made our teeth ache, frequencies that seemed to vibrate through our bones. It was as if whoever was singing knew exactly how to create the most unsettling acoustic effects in that concrete space. Ryan, typically the bravest among us, decided to investigate. Against my better judgment, I followed him toward the shower area, while Danny remained frozen at the sink, his face pale with fear. Ryan approached the shower entrance with cautious steps, his sneakers squeaking against the damp concrete floor. The yellow caution tape had been torn down, hanging in strips from the doorframe like grotesque party streamers. The singing continued, now clearly coming from the farthest shower stall, echoing off the walls with an almost supernatural resonance. When Ryan peered around the entrance, his reaction was immediate and terrifying. He jumped backward with such force that he nearly knocked me over, his face drained of all color. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, as if he were trying to scream but couldn't produce any sound. His eyes remained fixed on the shower entrance, wide with genuine terror. "What did you see?" I demanded, grabbing his arm. Ryan's entire body was trembling, and he seemed unable to form coherent words. He just pointed toward the shower entrance, his hand shaking violently. Driven by morbid curiosity and the need to understand what had terrified my friend so completely, I stepped toward the entrance myself. The singing had stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. The shower area was darker than the main bathroom, with only 2 functioning lights casting harsh shadows between the stalls. What I saw will forever be burned into my memory. In the farthest shower stall stood a man, completely motionless, He was wearing nothing but stained boxer shorts, his body unnaturally pale and seemingly malnourished. His hair was long and unkempt, hanging in greasy strands over his face. But what terrified me most was his posture. He stood perfectly still, facing the wall, his arms hanging limply at his sides. The man didn't respond to our presence. He didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge us in any way. He simply stood there like a grotesque statue, completely motionless. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, without warning, he began singing again. The same haunting melody, but now it seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the walls and ceiling. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. This wasn't a counselor or maintenance worker. This was a stranger, an intruder who had somehow entered our supposedly secure camp. The implications were terrifying. If this man could enter the bathroom facility undetected, what else might he be capable of? Ryan and I ran from the bathroom facility as if our lives depended on it. Our feet pounded against the gravel path, sending stones flying in all directions. Danny, who had witnessed our panicked exit, abandoned his position at the sink and followed us into the night without question. Behind us, the singing continued, now seeming to follow us through the darkness. We burst through our cabin door with such force that it slammed against the wall, startling Jerome awake. The sound of our panicked breathing filled the small space as we struggled to catch our breath and process what we had witnessed. Brandon, who had been reviewing the next day's schedule at his desk, immediately sensed something was seriously wrong. "What happened?" he demanded, rising from his chair. His military training was evident in his immediate alertness and the way he quickly assessed our frightened state. Ryan was still too shaken to speak coherently. He sat on his bunk, staring at the floor and occasionally glancing toward the cabin door as if expecting something to follow us. Danny kept looking out the window, his face pressed against the glass, watching the bathroom facility in the distance. I forced myself to explain what we had encountered, describing the unauthorized singing, the man in the shower, and his disturbing motionless stance. Brandon listened intently, his expression growing increasingly serious as I provided more details about the intruder's appearance and behavior. "Stay here," Brandon ordered, grabbing his radio and a flashlight from his desk. "Lock the door behind me and don't open it for anyone except me or another counselor you recognize." He also retrieved something from his locked desk drawer. I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a security device, though I couldn't identify it specifically. As Brandon prepared to leave, Jerome finally spoke up. "I heard the singing too," he admitted quietly. "I thought I was imagining it, but it's been going on for the past 3 nights. Always around this time, always from the bathroom building." This revelation sent a new wave of terror through our group. If the intruder had been present for multiple nights, it meant our camp's security had been compromised for days without anyone in authority knowing about it. Brandon left the cabin with grim determination, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as he approached the bathroom facility. From our cabin window, we watched his progress, our faces pressed against the glass like frightened children. The singing had stopped completely, and the camp seemed unnaturally quiet. When Brandon reached the bathroom building, he paused at the entrance, apparently listening for any sounds from inside. We could see him speaking into his radio, likely calling for backup or reporting the situation to the camp administration. After several minutes, he entered the building, his flashlight beam visible through the windows as he moved through the interior. The waiting was unbearable. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound from outside made us jump. Danny had armed himself with a baseball bat from the cabin's sports equipment, while Ryan sat on his bed, still trembling and occasionally muttering fragments of what he had witnessed. After what felt like an eternity, Brandon emerged from the bathroom building. Even from a distance, we could see his confusion and concern. He was speaking animatedly into his radio, gesturing toward the building and occasionally looking around the surrounding area, as if searching for something. When Brandon returned to our cabin, his expression was troubled. "I need to tell you what I found," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made us all lean forward attentively. There was no one in the bathroom building, no one at all. We stared at him in disbelief. "But we saw him," I protested. "He was standing in the shower stall singing." "We all heard it." Brandon nodded grimly. "I found evidence that someone had been there recently. The shower area showed signs of occupancy, wet footprints, disturbed dust patterns, and..." He paused, seeming reluctant to continue. and there was a small tape recorder hidden in the back shower stall. It was playing a recording of someone singing. The implications hit us immediately. Someone had deliberately placed that recording device intending to create exactly the kind of terror we had experienced. But that didn't explain the physical presence we had witnessed. The man standing motionless in the shower. Brandon's discovery triggered an immediate camp-wide security alert. Within minutes, our cabin was surrounded by flashlight beams as counselors and staff members conducted a thorough search of the entire facility. The camp director, Mr. Patterson, arrived with several police officers who had been participating in the camp's training program. We were questioned extensively about our experience, with each of us providing detailed accounts of what we had witnessed. The police officers took our statement seriously, treating the incident as a potential security breach rather than a teenage prank or misunderstanding. The tape recorder was placed deliberately, Officer Rodriguez explained to us. Someone wanted to create fear and confusion, but we need to understand how they gained access to the facility and whether they're still on the premises. The entire camp was placed under lockdown. No one was allowed to leave their cabins without escort, and additional security measures were implemented immediately. Police officers patrolled the grounds with trained dogs, searching for any signs of the intruder or evidence of how they had entered the camp. Despite the increased security presence, I found rest impossible that night. Every sound from outside made my heart race, and I kept replaying the image of the motionless man in the shower. The tape recorder explanation didn't account for the physical presence we had witnessed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had encountered something far more dangerous than a simple prankster. Ryan remained in a state of shock, refusing to discuss what he had seen in detail. Danny stayed awake all night, keeping watch at the window and occasionally reporting suspicious shadows or movements to Brandon. Jerome, who had initially seemed the most nervous among us, now appeared strangely calm, as if the confirmation of his fears had brought him some form of relief. The investigation continued through the night, with search teams combing every building and trail within a 2-mile radius of the camp. Despite their thorough efforts, no trace of the intruder was found. The following morning brought disturbing revelations about our camp's recent history. Mr. Patterson called an emergency assembly, where he addressed the entire camp about the previous night's incident. His words carried a weight that suggested he knew more than he was initially willing to share. "We've discovered that similar incidents have occurred at other camps in this region over the past 2 years," he announced. "An individual or individuals have been targeting youth camps, using psychological terror tactics to frighten campers and staff. The police investigation revealed that the intruder had sophisticated knowledge of the camp's layout and security protocols. The tape recorder had been professionally concealed, and the timing of its activation suggested careful planning and observation of our nightly routines." What disturbed me most was Officer Rodriguez's private conversation with Brandon, which I partially overheard. The intruder's methods matched a pattern of incidents that had escalated over time. At other camps, the initial psychological tactics had been followed by more direct confrontations and, in one case, an actual physical assault. "We believe he's been watching this camp for weeks," Officer Rodriguez explained to the assembled counselors. "He knows your routines, your security gaps, and your campers' behaviors. This wasn't a random intrusion. It was a carefully planned psychological attack." The camp's administration decided to continue operations with enhanced security measures, but many parents chose to withdraw their children immediately. Ryan's parents arrived that afternoon, and I watched as they drove away, Ryan's face pale and haunted in the back seat. Danny's family made the same decision, leaving Jerome and me among the few campers who remained. The final weeks of camp were overshadowed by constant vigilance and fear. Additional security personnel were hired, and our movements were strictly monitored. The bathroom facility was permanently closed, with temporary facilities installed closer to the cabin areas. But the psychological damage was done. Even with increased security, I felt constantly watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every unexpected sound made me jump. The man in the shower had achieved his goal. He had stolen our sense of safety and replaced it with persistent, gnawing fear. Years later, I still think about that night and wonder who he was and what motivated him to terrorize children. The incident taught me that true horror doesn't require supernatural elements. Sometimes the most frightening monsters are the ones that walk among us, wearing human faces and carrying human malice. The experience changed my perspective on safety and trust. I learned that even in supposedly secure environments, supervised by responsible adults and protected by established protocols, danger can still find a way to intrude. That lesson, learned at 15 in a concrete bathroom facility surrounded by Oregon wilderness, has stayed with me ever since. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I still hear echoes of that haunting melody, and I'm reminded that some experiences leave marks that never fully heal. The man in the shower may have disappeared into the night, but the terror he created continues to resonate, a reminder that evil can appear anywhere, at any time, wearing the most ordinary of faces.